January 8, 2024. Polar bear kills 65-year-old priest outside remote church in Nunavut. Father Richard Michael Hayes had served the remote communities of Nunavut for 37 years, longer than any priest before him in the vast Arctic territory. At 65, his weathered face bore the permanent marks of countless blizzards, his pale blue eyes reflecting both the endless ice and an unwavering faith that had sustained him through the darkest polar nights. He stood 6 feet tall, with a lean frame, hardened by decades of harsh living, his once dark hair now completely silver beneath his traditional black toque. The parishioners of St. Paul's Mission in Rankin Inlet knew him as a man who never missed evening prayers, even when the temperature dropped to -40 degrees Celsius and the wind howled across Hudson Bay with the fury of ancient gods. Born in Corner Brook, Newfoundland in 1958, Richard Hayes had been the youngest of 7 children raised by his fisherman father, Thomas Hayes, and his devoutly Catholic mother, Margaret O'Brien Hayes. The Hayes family lived in a small clapboard house overlooking Trinity Bay, where young Richard learned to read the weather patterns in cloud formations and the behavior of seabirds. His calling to the priesthood came early, at age 14, during a particularly brutal storm that claimed 3 fishing boats from their village. While helping his mother tend to the widows and orphans left behind, Richard experienced what he would later describe as a divine revelation, a certainty that his life's purpose was to bring comfort to those facing the harshest trials of existence. After completing his seminary training at Grand Seminary in Montreal, Father Hayes volunteered for missionary work in Canada's most remote regions. His first assignment took him to a small Inuit community on Baffin Island, where he spent 5 years learning Inuktitut and developing a deep respect for traditional Arctic survival knowledge. The elders taught him to read the ice, to recognize the signs of approaching storms, and most importantly, to understand the behavior of polar bears. Old Uki Kapianak, a respected hunter and community elder, had specifically warned him about the increasing unpredictability of polar bear movements due to changing ice conditions. "Nanook is confused now," Uki had told him in accented English, using the traditional Inuktitut name for the great white bears. "The ice breaks too early, forms too late. When Nanook is hungry and confused, he becomes very dangerous, even to those who know the old ways." St. Paul's Mission in Rankin Inlet was Father Hayes' 3rd and final assignment, a posting he had held for the past 15 years. The small wooden church, painted white with a red roof to stand out against the snow, sat on a slight rise overlooking the frozen Meliadine River. Built in 1967, the church served a community of approximately 2,800 people, mostly Inuit families who had maintained their traditional hunting and fishing lifestyle alongside modern conveniences like snowmobiles, satellite internet, and diesel generators. The building itself was simple but sturdy, constructed to withstand temperatures that could plummet to -50 degrees Celsius during the worst winter storms. The church interior featured hand-carved wooden pews, donated by families throughout the community, each bearing small brass plates inscribed with Inuktitut names. Behind the altar, a large wooden cross dominated the space, flanked by traditional Inuit carvings that Father Hayes had commissioned from local artists to honor both Christian and indigenous spiritual traditions. The combination of faiths was something Father Hayes had advocated throughout his career, believing that God's love transcended cultural boundaries and that the wisdom of the Inuit people reflected divine truth about survival and community in the harshest environments on Earth. January 8, 2024. began like countless other winter days in Rankin Inlet, with the temperature holding steady at -38 degrees Celsius under a clear sky that painted the snow-covered landscape in brilliant shades of blue and white. The sun, visible for only a few hours during the Arctic winter, cast long purple shadows across the tundra, while the aurora borealis danced in pale green curtains on the northern horizon. Father Hayes had risen at 5:30 in the morning, as was his custom, beginning his day with private prayers in the small rectory attached to the church. The rectory, a modest two-room structure with a wood-burning stove, had been his home for a decade and a half, its walls lined with photographs of the families he had served, and the baptisms, weddings, and funerals that marked the rhythm of Arctic life. Mary Kanguk Tutu, the church's volunteer coordinator and Father Hayes's closest confidant in the community, had arrived at 7 o'clock that morning to help prepare for the day's activities. Mary, a 53-year-old widow who had lost her husband to a hunting accident 5 years earlier, managed the church's daily operations with quiet efficiency. Her weathered hands, skilled in both traditional sewing and modern office work, had become indispensable to Father Hayes as his arthritis worsened with age. She spoke fluent English, French, and Inuktitut, making her invaluable as a translator during community meetings and religious ceremonies. "Father, the weather radio is predicting strong winds tonight," Mary had told him as she hung her heavy parka on a hook near the door. "Maybe you should come home with me after evening prayers instead of walking back alone." Her concern was evident in her dark eyes, which had seen too many good people lost to the unforgiving Arctic conditions. Mary lived in a government-subsidized housing unit about a quarter-mile from the church, a small but warm home she shared with her 28-year-old daughter Sarah and her 3 grandchildren. Father Hayes had smiled at her motherly concern, an expression that created deep lines around his eyes. "Mary, I've been walking these paths for 15 years. The good Lord has kept me safe this long." He gestured toward the window where the morning sun created a dazzling display on the snow. "Besides, look at that beautiful sky. It's going to be a perfect day for prayers." The morning service had drawn a typical winter congregation of about 40 people, mostly elderly community members and young mothers with small children who couldn't venture far in the extreme cold. The church's oil heating system worked overtime to maintain a comfortable temperature, the ancient furnace in the basement groaning and clicking with mechanical effort. Father Hayes delivered his sermon in both English and halting Inuktitut, his pronunciation still imperfect after decades of practice, but his sincerity unmistakable. He spoke about perseverance through hardship, drawing parallels between Christ's trials in the desert and the daily challenges of Arctic life. Among the congregation that morning was Tommy Iqaluit, a 26-year-old mechanic who maintained the community's snowmobiles and all-terrain vehicles. Tommy had grown up in Rankin Inlet and remembered Father Hayes baptizing him as an infant, though his own relationship with formal religion had grown complicated as he struggled with alcohol addiction and the cultural pressures of living between traditional and modern worlds. He sat in the back pew with his girlfriend Jennifer Mikijuk, a 19-year-old college student home on winter break from her nursing program in Winnipeg. Jennifer's presence in the community always brought Father Hayes joy, as he had encouraged her education and helped her family navigate the scholarship application process. Also present was Dr. James McKinnon, the community's primary physician, who had moved to Rankin Inlet from Halifax 18 months earlier as part of a federal program to improve healthcare in remote Arctic communities. Dr. McKinnon, 42 years old with prematurely grey hair and wire-rimmed glasses, had developed enormous respect for Father Hayes's role in community mental health and spiritual wellness. The two men often collaborated on cases involving domestic violence, substance abuse, and the high suicide rates that plagued many Arctic communities. Following the morning service, Father Hayes spent the afternoon visiting homebound parishioners, a duty he never delegated, despite Mary's offers to accompany him. His first stop was the home of Elizabeth Ningiok, an 84-year-old widow who lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of town. Elizabeth, nearly blind from diabetes complications, looked forward to Father Hayes' weekly visits more than any other event in her solitary routine. He would read to her from the Bible in Inuktitut, help her with small household tasks, and most importantly, simply sit and listen as she shared memories of her deceased husband and her fears about dying alone. "Father, my dreams have been strange lately," Elizabeth had told him that afternoon as they shared tea and bannock bread in her small kitchen. "I see Nanook walking through the village, but he's not hunting seals. He's looking for something else, something that frightens me." Her words were spoken in Inuktitut, but Father Hayes understood enough to grasp her meaning. Dreams held special significance in Inuit culture, often interpreted as warnings or messages from the spirit world. Father Hayes had taken her weathered hand in his own, feeling the paper-thin skin and prominent bones of advanced age. "Elizabeth, dreams often reflect our worries about things we cannot control. The polar bears are struggling with the changing ice, just as we all struggle with changes in our lives, but we must trust that God watches over us, and over the bears too." His next visit had been to the Kanguk family home, where 8-year-old Peter Kanguk was recovering from pneumonia. The boy's parents, both in their early 30s, worked at the local mine and struggled to balance their demanding schedules with caring for their sick child. Father Hayes brought coloring books and small wooden toys, sitting on the floor beside Peter's bed to play simple games and tell stories. The child's fever had broken 2 days earlier, but his recovery was slow, and the family worried about complications in the absence of specialized pediatric care. Peter's father, David Kanguk, was Mary's nephew and had inherited the family's traditional knowledge of hunting and weather patterns. During Father Hayes' visit, David mentioned seeing fresh polar bear tracks near the community garbage dump, about 2 miles from the church. "They're coming closer to town," David had said, his voice carrying the quiet concern of someone who understood the danger. "The ice on Hudson Bay isn't forming properly this year. The bears can't hunt seals like they used to." Father Hayes had nodded thoughtfully, making a mental note to discuss the bear sightings with the local wildlife officers. Polar bear encounters in Rankin Inlet weren't uncommon, but the animals typically avoided human settlements unless driven by extreme hunger or territorial disputes. The community maintained strict protocols for dealing with bear sightings, including an early warning system that used radio communications to alert residents when bears were spotted near town. As afternoon faded into evening, Father Hayes returned to St. Paul's mission to prepare for evening prayers, a service he had never missed in 15 years of ministry in Rankin Inlet. The temperature had dropped to -42 degrees Celsius, and the wind had picked up significantly, creating the conditions for a potential ground blizzard. The aurora borealis was already visible in the darkening sky, sheets of green and blue light dancing across the star-filled heavens, in patterns that seemed to shift and breathe with supernatural life. Evening prayers typically drew a smaller congregation than morning services, usually between 15 and 25 people, depending on weather conditions and work schedules. That night, 19 community members gathered in the warm sanctuary, their heavy coats and boots creating small pools of melted snow near the entrance. The group included several familiar faces: Mary Tutu and her daughter Sarah, Dr. McKinnon, who often attended evening services after completing his rounds at the community health center, Janet Tutu, a 58-year-old schoolteacher who had taught 3 generations of local children, and Robert Ivaluarjuk, the community's senior conservation officer responsible for monitoring wildlife interactions. Robert's presence was particularly significant given the recent polar bear sightings. At 45, he represented the third generation of his family to serve in wildlife management, combining traditional Inuit knowledge with modern conservation science. He had trained with Parks Canada and the government of Nunavut, learning to use tranquilizer guns, GPS tracking equipment, and polar bear deterrent devices. His grandfather had been a legendary bear hunter who killed more than 200 polar bears using traditional weapons and techniques, knowledge that Robert had adapted for modern wildlife management challenges. During the service, Father Hayes led the small congregation through familiar hymns and prayers, his voice carrying clearly through the wooden building despite the wind rattling the windows. He offered special prayers for community members facing health challenges, for the safe return of hunters who were out on the land, and for wisdom in dealing with the environmental changes affecting their traditional way of life. The service concluded with the Lord's Prayer, recited in both English and Inuktitut, the ancient words taking on special resonance in the Arctic setting where survival depended on faith, community, and respect for the natural world. As the congregation prepared to leave, bundling up in their heavy winter clothing, Mary Tutu approached Father Hayes with renewed concern about his walk home. "Father, Sarah can give you a ride in her truck. The wind is getting worse, and I don't like the idea of you walking alone tonight." Her daughter nodded in agreement, already putting on her insulated boots and reaching for her truck keys. Father Hayes appreciated their concern, but gently declined the offer, as he had done countless times before. "The rectory is only 200 yards away, and I need the fresh air after being inside all day. Besides, walking in weather like this reminds me how small we are compared to God's creation." He pulled on his heavy parka, a military surplus coat that had served him well for over a decade, and wrapped his woolen scarf around his neck. His insulated boots, rated for extreme Arctic conditions, were well worn but still functional. Robert Evaluajuk had been listening to this exchange with growing unease. His training and instincts told him that conditions were becoming dangerous, not just because of the weather, but because of the polar bear sign he had observed earlier in the day. "Father Hayes, I found fresh tracks about half a mile from here this afternoon. A big male, probably weighing over 800 pounds. Mary's right about getting a ride tonight." Father Hayes paused in his preparations, recognizing the seriousness in Robert's voice. Conservation officers didn't issue warnings lightly, especially not Robert, who had grown up surrounded by polar bears and understood their behavior better than almost anyone in the community. "How fresh were the tracks?" he asked, genuinely interested in Robert's assessment. "Less than 6 hours old when I found them around 2 o'clock. The bear was moving toward town, following the shoreline. Could be the same one that's been getting into garbage behind the northern store." Robert's expression was grave, his weather-beaten features reflecting years of dangerous encounters with Arctic wildlife. "These bears are desperate, Father. The sea ice is too thin for hunting, and they're starving. A hungry polar bear will attack anything that moves." Despite Robert's warning, Father Hayes remained determined to walk home, though he did agree to carry the church's emergency whistle and to radio Mary once he reached the rectory safely. The congregation dispersed into the windy night, most heading to vehicles parked behind the church or walking in groups toward the town center. Father Hayes locked the church doors, checked that all lights were turned off except for the security lighting, and began his familiar journey home. The path from St. Paul's Mission to the rectory was well-traveled and clearly marked, following a gentle slope down from the church toward a small cluster of trees that provided windbreak for the priest's modest home. Father Hayes had walked this route thousands of times in all weather conditions, navigating by memory and the distinctive landmarks that remained visible even in blizzard conditions. Tonight, the aurora borealis provided additional illumination, the dancing green lights casting shifting shadows across the snow-covered landscape. The wind had intensified significantly, creating ground-level snow devils that reduced visibility to less than 50 feet. Father Hayes walked with his head down, breathing through his scarf to prevent the frigid air from shocking his lungs. The temperature had dropped another 2 degrees, reaching -44 degrees Celsius, cold enough to cause frostbite on exposed skin within minutes. His boots crunched rhythmically through the snow, the sound muffled by the wind, but still audible enough to mask other noises in the darkness. Unknown to Father Hayes, he was not alone on the tundra that night. A massive male polar bear, weighing approximately 900 pounds and measuring nearly 10 feet in length, had been tracking human scent for the past hour. The bear, estimated to be between 15 and 20 years old, was in the advanced stages of starvation, having been unable to hunt successfully for nearly 4 months due to unusually thin sea ice on Hudson Bay. His normal white fur had taken on a yellowish tinge from malnutrition and stress, and his enormous black nose constantly tested the air for any potential food source. This particular bear had been observed intermittently by community members for the past 3 weeks, always at a distance and usually near the garbage dump or fish processing area where scents attracted his attention. Robert Evaluajuk had filed reports with territorial wildlife officials, but resources for polar bear management were limited, and the bear had not yet displayed overtly aggressive behavior toward humans. The standard protocol was to monitor the situation and intervene only if the bear entered residential areas or showed signs of targeting people. The bear's hunting instincts had been honed by 2 decades of survival in one of the planet's most challenging environments. Despite his weakened condition, he remained one of nature's most efficient predators, capable of detecting human scent from several miles away and moving across snow and ice with surprising stealth for such a massive animal. His enormous paws, nearly a foot wide, distributed his weight evenly across the snow surface, allowing him to approach potential prey without making significant noise. As Father Hayes made his way down the familiar path, the bear was positioning himself in a small depression about 100 yards away, using the natural topography to remain hidden while assessing this potential meal. The bear's excellent night vision allowed him to track the priest's movement, despite the poor visibility conditions, and his highly developed sense of smell provided detailed information about this human's physical condition, emotional state, and potential threat level. Polar bears are ambush predators by nature, preferring to attack from concealment rather than engaging in prolonged chases. This bear had successfully hunted seals using similar tactics for most of his adult life, waiting motionlessly near breathing holes in the sea ice until prey surfaced, then striking with explosive speed and devastating power. The transition from hunting seals to potentially hunting humans required no significant adaptation of technique, only the opportunity and desperation that extreme hunger provided. Father Hayes was approximately halfway between the church and the rectory when he first sensed something unusual in his environment. The sensation was subtle, more instinctual than rational, a feeling that he was being observed or followed. He paused in his walk, turning to look back toward the church, but saw only the familiar glow of the security lights and the swirling snow. The wind continued to howl across the tundra, carrying with it the scents of the Arctic night, snow, ice, and the faint petroleum odor from the community's fuel storage tanks. The priest's lifetime of experience in remote locations had taught him to trust such intuitions, even when they seemed irrational. He had survived dangerous situations in the past by listening to subtle warnings that his conscious mind couldn't fully process. Standing still in the wind and cold, he strained his senses for any indication of what might have triggered his unease. The aurora borealis continued its ethereal dance overhead, providing intermittent illumination that revealed nothing but empty tundra in all directions. After several minutes of careful observation, Father Hayes convinced himself that his nervousness was simply a product of Robert's earlier warnings about polar bear activity in the area. He resumed his walk toward the rectory, moving perhaps slightly faster than usual, but not running or showing obvious signs of panic. His breath created small ice crystals that immediately froze to his scarf, and he pulled his hood up more tightly around his face to conserve body heat. The polar bear had been watching this human behavior with the patient intelligence that made his species such successful hunters. He recognized the pause in movement as a potential indication that his presence had been detected, but the resumption of normal walking patterns suggested that his concealment remained effective. The bear began moving parallel to Father Hayes's route, staying approximately 50 yards away and using small ridges in the terrain to remain hidden from view. At this point in the encounter, several factors were working against Father Hayes's survival. The extreme weather conditions that limited visibility also masked the bear's approach, while the wind direction carried the priest's scent directly toward the predator while preventing him from detecting the bear's distinctive smell. The aurora borealis, though beautiful, created shifting light patterns that made it difficult to distinguish between shadows, snow formations, and potential threats. Most critically, Father Hayes's predictable routine and familiar route made him an easy target for an ambush predator that had been observing human patterns around the community. The bear's hunting experience told him that this prey was moving toward an isolated location, away from other humans, presenting an ideal opportunity for an attack with minimal risk of interference. The rectory, while only 200 yards from the church, was separated from the main community by enough distance to ensure that any sounds of an attack would be muffled by wind and unlikely to attract immediate help. As Father Hayes approached the final stretch of path leading to his home, the bear made his decision to attack. Moving with surprising grace for such a massive animal, he closed the distance to approximately 20 yards, while remaining concealed behind a low snowdrift. The bear's heart rate increased as adrenaline flooded his system, preparing his body for the explosive burst of speed that would carry him to his target. His powerful muscles, despite being weakened by months of poor nutrition, still retained enough strength to generate tremendous force. The attack began at exactly 8:47 p.m., according to the automatic timestamp on Father Hayes' emergency radio, which would later be found activated but smashed beyond repair. The bear erupted from concealment with the sudden violence that had made polar bears the apex predators of the Arctic, covering 20 yards of rough terrain in less than 3 seconds. His massive paws threw up clouds of snow as he charged, and his distinctive growl, a sound that combined roar and snarl into something primal and terrifying, carried clearly through the wind. Father Hayes had perhaps 2 seconds to process what was happening before the bear struck him. In those brief moments, his mind registered the enormous white shape emerging from the darkness, the unmistakable sound of a polar bear's hunting call, and the absolute certainty that he was about to die. His hand moved instinctively toward the emergency whistle in his pocket, but there was no time to use it before 900 pounds of desperate predator collided with his much smaller frame. The initial impact drove Father Hayes backward into the snow with tremendous force, the bear's momentum carrying both bodies several feet from the attack point. The priest's heavy winter clothing provided some protection against the bear's claws, but was no match for the animal's crushing weight and powerful jaws. Father Hayes tried to call out for help, but the bear's first bite crushed his larynx and made speech impossible. His vision filled with the bear's massive head and the terrible intelligence in its black eyes as it positioned itself for a killing bite to his neck. The bear's hunting instincts drove him to inflict maximum damage quickly, both to prevent his prey from escaping and to minimize the risk of injury to himself during the attack. Polar bears in the wild typically killed seals with a single bite to the head or neck, using their powerful jaws to crush vital structures and cause rapid death. The bear attempted to apply the same technique to Father Hayes, gripping the priest's head and neck area with teeth designed to penetrate thick blubber and crush bones. Father Hayes's final conscious thoughts were a mixture of physical pain, spiritual preparation for death, and profound sadness at leaving his community without their spiritual leader. Despite the terror and agony of his situation, his faith provided him with a measure of peace, and his last coherent prayer was for the safety of his parishioners and for God's mercy on the bear that was killing him. The priest lost consciousness within 30 seconds of the initial attack, his body going into traumatic shock as massive injuries overwhelmed his cardiovascular system. The bear continued his attack for several more minutes, driven by starvation and predatory instincts that demanded complete neutralization of potential threats. The priest's heavy winter clothing was torn away in strips, exposing flesh to the Arctic wind and the bear's continued feeding behavior. The snow around the attack site was quickly stained dark red, creating a grisly crime scene that would haunt investigators and community members for years to come. By 9:15 p.m., when Father Hayes had failed to radio Mary Tutu as promised, the bear had concluded his attack and begun feeding on his victim. The priest's body temperature was already dropping rapidly in the extreme cold, while the bear's behavior became more territorial and aggressive as he claimed his kill. The aurora borealis continued to dance overhead, its green and blue lights illuminating a scene of primal violence that seemed to belong to an earlier age when humans were prey animals struggling to survive in an hostile world. Mary Tutu had been waiting by her radio for Father Hayes's check-in call since 9 p.m., her concern growing with each passing minute. By 9:20, she had tried calling him 3 times without receiving a response, and her maternal instincts told her that something was seriously wrong. She called Sarah into the kitchen and explained the situation, watching as her daughter's expression shifted from mild concern to genuine alarm. "Mom, Father Hayes never misses his radio calls. Never." Sarah was already reaching for her heavy coat and boots. "We need to go check on him right now." At 28 years old, Sarah had inherited her mother's practical nature and her grandmother's intuitive understanding of Arctic dangers. She worked as a dental hygienist at the community health center and had seen enough medical emergencies to recognize when situations required immediate action. Mary tried calling the church directly, hoping that Father Hayes might have returned to retrieve something he had forgotten, but the phone rang without answer. She then attempted to reach Robert Evaluarjuk, knowing that the conservation officer would have both the authority and equipment to respond to a potential wildlife emergency. Robert answered on the second ring, and Mary could hear wind and engine noise in the background, indicating that he was already out on patrol. "Robert, Father Hayes didn't radio in after evening prayers. He was supposed to call by 9 o'clock. Mary's voice carried the controlled urgency of someone trying not to panic while recognizing genuine danger. "Can you swing by the church and check on him?" Robert's response was immediate and decisive. "I'm already heading that way. I found more bear sign this afternoon, and I've been worried about people walking alone tonight." The sound of his snowmobile engine increased as he accelerated toward the church. "Mary, call Dr. McKinnon and have him standing by at the health center. Also call the RCMP detachment and tell them we might have a code red wildlife incident." A code red wildlife incident was the most serious classification in Nunavut's emergency response protocols, indicating an attack on humans by large predators. The designation automatically triggered response from multiple agencies, including the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, Territorial Conservation Officers, Emergency Medical Services, and, if necessary, Canadian Armed Forces search and rescue personnel. The protocol had been developed following several fatal polar bear attacks in Arctic communities during the 1990s, and it emphasized rapid response and coordinated action to prevent additional casualties. Sarah Tutu was already starting her pickup truck, a heavy-duty Ford F-250 equipped with oversized tires and emergency survival gear required by territorial law for all vehicles operating in remote areas. The truck's powerful diesel engine struggled briefly in the extreme cold before settling into a rough idle, while the heater began the slow process of warming the cab. Sarah had installed additional emergency lights on the vehicle's roof, creating a beacon that would be visible for miles across the flat tundra. At 9:28 p.m., Robert Ivaluajuk arrived at St. Paul's Mission on his Polaris snowmobile, equipped with a high-powered searchlight and emergency communications equipment. The church appeared normal from the outside, with security lights illuminating the building and no signs of disturbance. Robert conducted a quick perimeter check, noting that Father Hayes's footprints were clearly visible in the snow leading away from the church toward the rectory, but that the tracks disappeared into an area of wind-blown snow about halfway along the route. Robert immediately recognized the significance of the missing footprints, understanding that either Father Hayes had been picked up by a vehicle or had left the established path for some reason. His searchlight revealed several other sets of tracks in the area, including what appeared to be the distinctive paw prints of a large polar bear. The conservation officer's training and experience told him that he was looking at the scene of a predator attack, but he needed to confirm the situation before calling for emergency backup. Moving carefully and keeping his tranquilizer rifle ready, Robert followed the mixed tracks toward a depression in the snow, about 100 yards from the church. His searchlight beam swept back and forth across the terrain, and within moments he spotted something that made his blood freeze despite the Arctic temperature. Scattered across an area roughly 30 feet in diameter were pieces of black cloth that he immediately recognized as fragments from Father Hayes's cassock, along with dark stains in the snow that could only be blood. "Jesus Christ," Robert whispered, his words immediately carried away by the wind. He had investigated dozens of wildlife attacks during his career, but the scene before him was among the worst he had ever witnessed. The sheer amount of blood and the scattered clothing indicated that Father Hayes had suffered massive trauma, almost certainly fatal injuries. Robert activated his emergency radio with hands that shook despite years of experience with violent animal encounters. "This is Conservation Officer Ivaluajuk requesting immediate code red response at St. Paul's Mission. We have a confirmed polar bear attack with one human victim. Repeat, code red wildlife incident with human casualty at the church." His voice carried clearly through the radio network, immediately alerting emergency responders throughout the Kivalik region. The response to Robert's emergency call was swift and professional, reflecting the efficiency of Arctic emergency services that dealt with life-threatening situations on a regular basis. Within 5 minutes, Dr. James McKinnon was in his vehicle heading toward the church, his emergency medical kit supplemented with blood products and trauma supplies. The RCMP Detachment Commander, Sergeant Patricia Williams, had dispatched 2 officers to secure the scene while alerting territorial headquarters about the incident. Sarah and Mary Tutu arrived at the church at 9:35 p.m., their truck's headlights adding illumination to Robert's investigation of the attack site. Mary took one look at the conservation officer's grim expression and immediately understood that their worst fears had been realized. She stayed in the truck while Sarah approached Robert, both women recognizing that they were witnessing the aftermath of a tragedy that would affect their entire community for years to come. "Is he—" Sarah couldn't finish the question, her voice breaking as she stared at the blood-stained snow and torn fabric scattered across the tundra. She had known Father Hayes since childhood, and the idea of his violent death was almost incomprehensible to someone who had grown up thinking of him as a permanent and protective presence in their community. Robert's response was gentle, but honest. "Sarah, I need you to take your mother home right now. This is a crime scene, and we need to preserve it for the investigators. Father Hayes is gone, and there's nothing anyone can do for him now." He guided her back toward the truck while maintaining visual contact with the attack site, his training emphasizing the importance of protecting evidence while managing civilian emotional responses. The polar bear responsible for Father Hayes' death had departed the immediate area, but remained within a few hundred yards of the attack site, drawn back repeatedly by the scent of blood and the territorial instinct to defend his kill. The bear's behavior following the attack reflected the complex psychology of polar bear predation, combining satisfaction at having obtained food with heightened alertness for potential competitors or threats. His massive form moved restlessly through the darkness, occasionally returning to investigate the increasing human activity around his kill site. Dr. McKinnon arrived at 9:42 p.m., his medical training immediately recognizing that the scene represented a recovery operation rather than a rescue mission. The amount of blood loss indicated in the snow made survival impossible, even if Father Hayes had received immediate medical attention. The doctor's primary responsibility shifted from patient care to supporting the emotional needs of community members who were arriving at the scene despite official efforts to keep civilians away from the danger zone. RCMP Constable Michael Chen and Constable Jennifer Nakamura established a security perimeter around the attack site, while Sergeant Williams coordinated with territorial emergency management officials in Iqaluit. The investigation protocol for fatal wildlife attacks required careful documentation of all physical evidence, interviews with all witnesses, and comprehensive assessment of the circumstances leading to the encounter. The presence of an active polar bear in the area also created ongoing safety concerns for both investigators and community members. By 10 p.m., word of Father Hayes' death had spread throughout Rankin Inlet, despite official efforts to control information until family notifications could be completed. In small Arctic communities, news traveled quickly through informal networks of radio communications, telephone calls, and face-to-face conversations. The shock of losing such a beloved community figure to such a violent death created a collective trauma that affected virtually every resident. Tommy Iqaluit and Jennifer Mikijuk were among the first community members to arrive at the scene, having heard about the attack through Jennifer's police scanner radio. Tommy had served as an altar boy for Father Hayes during his childhood and credited the priest with helping him overcome early struggles with substance abuse. The young mechanic stood at the edge of the police perimeter, tears freezing on his cheeks as he stared at the evidence of his mentor's violent death. The search for Father Hayes' remains became a complex operation involving multiple agencies and specialized personnel. The extreme cold and wind conditions made the search dangerous for investigators, while the presence of an aggressive polar bear in the area required armed protection for anyone working at the scene. Robert Evaluar-Juk coordinated the wildlife management aspects of the operation, while RCMP investigators focused on documenting evidence and determining the exact sequence of events. At 10:30 p.m., searchers located additional remains approximately 50 yards from the initial attack site, indicating that the bear had moved parts of his victim to a secondary location for feeding. The discovery was particularly traumatic for the search team, as it confirmed that Father Hayes had been partially consumed by his attacker. The bear's feeding behavior, while natural from a biological perspective, added an element of horror to the tragedy that would haunt community members for years. Conservation officers from across Nunavut were mobilized to assist with the polar bear hunt that began immediately following the attack. The bear responsible for Father Hayes' death had become a confirmed man-eater and posed an immediate threat to anyone in the Rankin Inlet area. The hunt team included officers armed with high-powered rifles, tranquilizer equipment, and thermal imaging devices to track the bear through the Arctic darkness. The bear was located at 11:45 p.m., approximately half a mile from the attack site, using thermal imaging equipment mounted on a helicopter that had been dispatched from Churchill, Manitoba. The animal showed no fear of the approaching aircraft, a behavioral change that indicated his transition from normal polar bear behavior to the aggressive territoriality that characterizes man-eating bears. The decision to destroy the bear rather than attempt relocation was made immediately, based on standard protocols that prioritize human safety over wildlife conservation in cases of confirmed predatory attacks. Robert Ivaluajuk delivered the killing shot from a distance of 75 yards using a .375 H and H Magnum rifle loaded with solid copper bullets designed to penetrate the bear's thick skull and heavy muscle mass. The bear died instantly, his massive body falling motionless onto the blood-stained snow where he had been defending his kill site. The conservation officer felt no satisfaction in the kill, understanding that the bear had been driven to attack by starvation and environmental pressures beyond his control. The recovery of Father Hayes' remains was completed by 2:30 a.m. on January 9th, with investigators working under portable floodlights in conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. The extreme cold made evidence collection difficult, as standard forensic procedures had to be modified for Arctic conditions. The priest's body was transported to the community health center, where Dr. McKinnon conducted a preliminary examination before the remains were prepared for transport to a larger medical facility for complete autopsy. News of Father Hayes' death reached his family in Newfoundland through official RCMP channels at approximately 3 a.m. Atlantic time. His eldest brother, Thomas Hayes Jr., received the notification call at his home in Corner Brook, where he worked as a high school principal. The family's grief was compounded by the violent circumstances of Richard's death and the logistical challenges of traveling to Nunavut for funeral arrangements during the depths of Arctic winter. The Catholic Diocese of Churchill-Hudson Bay, which oversaw Father Hayes' ministry, was notified of his death by Bishop Michael Thompson at 4 a.m. Central Time. Bishop Thompson had worked closely with Father Hayes for over 2 decades and considered him one of the most dedicated and effective priests in the Arctic mission system. The bishop immediately began making arrangements for temporary pastoral coverage for the Rankin Inlet community, while planning a memorial service that would honor Father Hayes' 37 years of northern ministry. Dawn on January 9th revealed the full scope of the tragedy to community members who gathered at St. Paul's Mission to pay their respects and begin the grieving process. The attack site remained cordoned off by police tape, while bloodstains in the snow provided a grim reminder of the violence that had claimed their beloved priest. The church itself seemed smaller and more vulnerable without Father Hayes' reassuring presence, and many community members struggled to understand how such a tragedy could occur in a place they considered sacred and safe. Mary Tutu assumed responsibility for coordinating the community's response to Father Hayes' death. Drawing on her administrative skills and deep connections throughout Rankin Inlet, she organized meal delivery for families affected by the tragedy, coordinated with media representatives who began arriving from southern Canada, and worked with church officials to plan memorial services that would accommodate the hundreds of people expected to attend from across the Arctic. The investigation into Father Hayes' death continued for several weeks, with wildlife biologists examining the bear's remains to determine factors that might have contributed to the attack. The bear was found to be severely malnourished, weighing approximately 200 pounds less than normal for an adult male of his size. Stomach contents revealed that he had been surviving primarily on garbage and carrion for several months, indicating that normal hunting opportunities had been unavailable due to poor ice conditions. Climate change emerged as a significant factor in the analysis of the attack, with scientists noting that Hudson Bay ice formation had been delayed by nearly 6 weeks compared to historical averages. The extended ice-free period had prevented polar bears from accessing their primary hunting grounds, forcing them to remain on land during the period when they would normally be hunting seals to build up fat reserves for the summer fasting period. The polar bear population in the Hudson Bay region had been under stress for several years due to changing environmental conditions, with earlier ice breakup and later freeze-up creating shorter hunting seasons and reduced reproductive success. The bear that killed Father Hayes represented a broader conservation crisis affecting the entire subspecies, as traditional hunting patterns became disrupted by rapid climate change. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a polar bear research specialist from the University of Manitoba, arrived in Rankin Inlet 3 days after the attack to assist with the biological investigation. Her analysis of the bear's condition and behavior patterns provided important insights into the factors that led to the fatal encounter. The bear's age, estimated at between 15 and 20 years, placed him in the demographic most likely to engage in desperate behavior when facing starvation. The community's response to Father Hayes' death reflected the deep cultural importance of spiritual leadership in Arctic communities, where isolation and harsh living conditions create special needs for emotional and spiritual support. The priest had served multiple generations of families, baptizing children who grew up to be married and buried by him in the endless cycle of northern life. His death left a void that extended far beyond religious services to encompass counseling, community mediation, and cultural bridge building between traditional and modern ways of life. Mental health professionals from across Nunavut were dispatched to Rankin Inlet to help community members process the trauma of losing Father Hayes in such a violent manner. The combination of grief, shock, and fear created a complex emotional environment that required specialized intervention. Many residents reported difficulty sleeping, anxiety about outdoor activities, and recurring nightmares about polar bear attacks. Children in the community were particularly affected by Father Hayes' death, as he had been a fixture in their lives through school visits, youth programs, and family celebrations. The violent nature of his death challenged their understanding of safety and security in their familiar environment, while the loss of his gentle guidance left them without an important source of emotional support during the difficult Arctic winter months. The funeral arrangements for Father Hayes became a complex logistical challenge involving multiple organizations and jurisdictions. His body was transported to Winnipeg for autopsy and embalming, then returned to Rankin Inlet for a community memorial service before final transport to his family burial plot in Newfoundland. The extreme weather conditions and limited air transportation options required careful coordination among airlines, government agencies, and church officials. More than 800 people attended Father Hayes' memorial service at the Rankin Inlet Community Center, the church being too small to accommodate the crowd that gathered to honor his memory. The service included traditional Catholic elements alongside Inuit spiritual practices, reflecting Father Hayes's lifetime commitment to cultural integration and mutual respect. Speakers included community elders, former altar boys who had become community leaders, and family members who had traveled from across Canada to pay their respects. Bishop Thompson delivered the primary eulogy, describing Father Hayes as a martyr who had died in service to his community and his faith. The bishop's words provided comfort to many mourners, while acknowledging the senseless tragedy of losing such a dedicated servant to circumstances beyond human control. The service concluded with the Lord's Prayer, recited in English, French, and Inuktitut, the same three languages in which Father Hayes had conducted services for 15 years. The investigation into Father Hayes's death was completed 6 weeks after the attack, with investigators concluding that no human error or negligence had contributed to the tragedy. The polar bear's behavior was determined to be consistent with starvation-driven predation, while Father Hayes's decision to walk home alone was deemed reasonable given his extensive experience and the routine nature of the journey. The report recommended enhanced polar bear monitoring around community areas and improved emergency communication systems for residents traveling alone. The long-term impact of Father Hayes's death extended far beyond the immediate grief and trauma experienced by the Rankin Inlet community. His replacement, Father Michael O'Brien, arrived 3 months later, but struggled to fill the void left by his predecessor's decades of community involvement. The new priest faced the additional challenge of serving a community traumatized by violence while dealing with increased polar bear activity. As climate change continued to disrupt traditional patterns, conservation officials implemented new protocols for polar bear management in response to Father Hayes's death, including more aggressive removal of bears, showing interest in community areas, and enhanced public education about avoiding dangerous encounters. The protocols reflected a shift toward prioritizing human safety over wildlife conservation in situations where the two objectives conflicted, a change that generated controversy among environmental advocates while receiving strong support from Arctic communities. The story of Father Hayes's death became a symbol of the broader challenges facing Arctic communities as climate change disrupted traditional relationships between humans and wildlife. His death was cited in scientific papers, policy documents, and media reports as evidence of the human costs associated with environmental change, while his life of service continued to inspire other missionaries and community workers throughout the Canadian North. Mary Tutu established the Father Richard Hayes Memorial Fund to support youth education programs in Rankin Inlet, ensuring that the priest's commitment to community development would continue despite his death. The fund provided scholarships for young people pursuing post-secondary education while supporting cultural programs that preserved traditional knowledge and values. The memorial became a lasting tribute to Father Hayes's belief in the potential of Arctic communities to adapt and thrive despite enormous challenges. 1 year after Father Hayes's death, the community held a memorial service that attracted visitors from across Nunavut and southern Canada. The service included the dedication of a bronze plaque at St. Paul's Mission, commemorating his 37 years of northern ministry and his ultimate sacrifice in service to his community. The plaque's inscription, written in English and Inuktitut, described him as a faithful servant who walked with his people through joy and sorrow until his journey ended in God's hands. The polar bear that killed Father Hayes was mounted by a taxidermist and displayed at the Nunavut Research Center in Iqaluit as part of an educational exhibit about human-wildlife conflicts in the Arctic. The display included information about Father Hayes's life and ministry, alongside scientific data about polar bear biology and behavior. The exhibit served as both a memorial to the priest and a warning about the increasing dangers posed by climate change to both human and animal populations in the Arctic. Dr. McKinnon, who had been among the first responders to the attack scene, left Rankin Inlet 6 months after Father Hayes' death, citing emotional exhaustion and post-traumatic stress related to the incident. His replacement, Dr. Sarah Chen, arrived with specialized training in trauma counseling and experience working in communities affected by wildlife attacks. The turnover reflected the long-term psychological impact of the tragedy on everyone involved in the response and recovery efforts. Robert Ivaluajuk continued his work as a conservation officer, but struggled with guilt and depression following the attack, questioning whether he could have done more to prevent Father Hayes' death. He eventually sought counseling and became an advocate for improved mental health services for first responders in remote communities. His experience highlighted the secondary trauma experienced by emergency personnel who deal with violent wildlife encounters in their professional duties. The investigation files from Father Hayes' death were eventually sealed and stored in the territorial archives, containing hundreds of photographs, witness statements, and scientific analyses that documented every aspect of the tragedy. The files served as a comprehensive record of how Arctic communities respond to wildlife emergencies, while providing data for researchers studying human bear conflicts in northern Canada. 3 years after the attack, climate scientists published a research paper using Father Hayes' death as a case study in the human impacts of changing Arctic conditions. The paper documented how delayed ice formation on Hudson Bay had created the conditions leading to the fatal encounter, while projecting that such incidents would become more common as global temperatures continued to rise. The research contributed to growing scientific consensus about the urgent need for climate change mitigation efforts. The church building where Father Hayes had conducted his final service was eventually renovated and rededicated as the Father Richard Hayes Community Center, serving multiple functions beyond religious worship. The renovation reflected the evolving needs of Arctic communities while honoring the memory of a man who had dedicated his life to serving those needs. The center hosted cultural events, educational programs, and community meetings that continued Father Hayes' work of bringing people together across cultural and generational divides. Sarah Tutu, who had been among the first to respond when Father Hayes failed to radio home, eventually became a registered nurse and returned to Rankin Inlet to work at the community health center. Her career choice was influenced by her experience during the tragedy and her desire to provide the kind of compassionate care that Father Hayes had offered to community members throughout his ministry. She often spoke about how the priest's example of service had shaped her understanding of professional duty and community responsibility. The memorial plaque at St. Paul's Mission became a pilgrimage site for Catholics throughout the Arctic, with visitors traveling hundreds of miles to pay their respects to Father Hayes' memory. The site attracted particular attention from other missionary priests who saw Father Hayes as a martyr who had died in service to his calling. The pilgrimage tradition reflected the broader impact of his death on the Catholic Church's mission work in remote areas of Canada. 10 years after Father Hayes' death, the community of Rankin Inlet had largely recovered from the immediate trauma of the attack, while maintaining strong memories of the priest's contributions to their community. New generations of children grew up hearing stories about Father Hayes from their parents and grandparents, ensuring that his legacy would continue even as direct memories of his life and death faded. The stories emphasized his kindness, dedication, and ultimate sacrifice, while serving as cautionary tales about the dangers of Arctic life. The polar bear population in the Hudson Bay region continued to decline in the years following Father Hayes' death, with scientists documenting reduced reproductive success and increased mortality rates related to climate change impacts. The bear that killed Father Hayes became representative of a species struggling to adapt to rapidly changing environmental conditions, highlighting the complex relationship between human tragedy and wildlife conservation in an era of global warming. Environmental organizations use Father Hayes' story to advocate for stronger climate change policies, arguing that his death represented a preview of future conflicts between humans and wildlife displaced by changing conditions. The advocacy efforts included documentary films, educational materials, and policy papers that connected his individual tragedy to broader patterns of environmental degradation and social disruption in the Arctic. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police incorporated lessons learned from the Father Hayes investigation into their training programs for officers serving in Arctic communities, emphasizing the importance of rapid response to wildlife emergencies and coordination with conservation authorities. The training materials included detailed case studies of the attack and response, ensuring that future incidents would benefit from the experience gained through this tragedy. 25 years after Father Hayes' death, the community of Rankin Inlet held a special anniversary memorial service that attracted hundreds of visitors, including many people who had been children when the priest was alive. The service featured testimonials from former altar boys, community leaders, and family members who shared memories of Father Hayes' impact on their lives. The anniversary marked the passage of enough time for the community to remember the priest primarily for his life of service rather than the circumstances of his death. The Father Richard Hayes Memorial Fund had grown to become one of the largest scholarship programs in Nunavut, providing educational opportunities for hundreds of young people from Arctic communities. The fund's success reflected the enduring influence of Father Hayes' belief in education and community development, while demonstrating how positive legacies can emerge from tragic circumstances. Recipients of the scholarships often return to their communities as teachers, healthcare workers, and community leaders, continuing the cycle of service that Father Hayes had exemplified. The scientific understanding of polar bear behavior and human-wildlife conflicts advanced significantly in the decades following Father Hayes' death, with researchers using data from his case and similar incidents to develop better prediction models and prevention strategies. The research contributed to improved safety protocols for people living and working in polar bear habitat, while informing conservation efforts aimed at protecting both human communities and bear populations. The story of Father Richard Michael Hayes, the 65-year-old priest who died serving his community in one of the world's most challenging environments, became a permanent part of Arctic history and Canadian Catholic tradition. His death on January 8, 2024, marked the end of a remarkable life of service, while highlighting the complex relationships between humans, wildlife, and changing environmental conditions in the Canadian North. The legacy of his sacrifice continues to influence Arctic communities, wildlife management policies, and climate change research, ensuring that his final contribution to the people he served extends far beyond his lifetime of dedicated ministry. The polar bear tracks in the snow around St. Paul's Mission were covered by fresh snowfall within days of the attack, erasing the physical evidence of the encounter while leaving permanent marks on the hearts and memories of everyone who had known Father Hayes. His story serves as both a tribute to the power of faith and service in harsh circumstances and a warning about the challenges that lie ahead for Arctic communities facing an uncertain environmental future. In the end, Father Richard Hayes died as he had lived, walking the difficult path between human needs and natural forces, serving his community until the very moment that the wilderness reclaimed him. The next stories, July 29th, 2025. Kodiak Bear mauls entire group. During camping expedition in Alaska, the morning fog clung to Afognak Island like a shroud, its tendrils weaving through the towering Sitka spruce that had stood sentinel over these remote Alaskan waters for centuries. Dr. Thomas Walker, a 34-year-old marine biologist from Seattle, adjusted the straps of his weathered Kelty backpack and breathed deeply of the crisp morning air, the salt tang from Shelikof Strait mixed with the rich earth smell of the temperate rainforest, creating an intoxicating cocktail that reminded him why he'd chosen this profession. Beside him, his wife, Dr. Emily Walker, 32, a wildlife veterinarian specializing in large mammals, methodically checked their GPS coordinates against the topographical map spread across the hood of their rented Ford Explorer. "We're at exactly 58.1167 degrees north, 152.7667 degrees west," Emily announced, her auburn hair catching the filtered sunlight that managed to penetrate the canopy above. "The trailhead for Afognak River Trail should be approximately 800 meters northeast of this position." Her green eyes, sharp and analytical from years of studying animal behavior, scanned the terrain ahead with the practiced gaze of someone who understood that nature demanded respect above all else. The third member of their expedition, Marcus Rodriguez, a 29-year-old wilderness photographer from Colorado, was already unpacking his extensive camera equipment. His weathered hands, scarred from years of climbing and outdoor adventures, handled the expensive Canon 5D Mark IV with the reverence of someone who understood that capturing the perfect shot often meant the difference between a successful expedition and mere tourism. "The light conditions are absolutely perfect," he murmured, adjusting the polarizing filter on his 70 to 200 millimeter telephoto lens. "The way this fog is lifting, we should have incredible visibility for wildlife photography within the next 2 hours." Dr. Sarah Chen, 38, a forest ecologist from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, emerged from behind the vehicle where she'd been organizing her botanical collection kit. Her black hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her wire-rimmed glasses reflected the dancing patterns of light filtering through the forest canopy. "Based on the phenological data I've been collecting over the past 5 seasons, we're hitting this location at the absolute peak time for both plant diversity and mammalian activity," she said, hefting her field notebook, a leather-bound journal that had accompanied her on expeditions from the Brooks Range to the Tongass National Forest. "The salmon runs are at their strongest right now, which means the brown bear population will be concentrated along the river systems." The fifth member of their group, Jake Morrison, a 31-year-old adventure guide and former military survival instructor, was performing his methodical equipment check. His pale blue eyes, which had seen combat in Afghanistan before he'd traded warfare for wilderness guiding, moved systematically over their collective gear. "Everyone's bear spray is secured in the outer pockets of their packs, correct?" he asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd kept dozens of expeditions safe in some of the world's most unforgiving environments. "And remember, we maintain a minimum 50-yard distance from any brown bears we encounter. These aren't the black bears you might see in the lower 48. A mature Kodiak can weigh upwards of 1,500 pounds and cover ground faster than an Olympic sprinter." The final member of their expedition, Dr. Rebecca Torres, a 35-year-old anthropologist studying the intersection of indigenous hunting practices and modern wildlife management, finished securing her digital recording equipment. Her dark brown hair, streaked with premature silver that spoke to long hours in harsh field conditions, was braided back in the practical style she'd learned during her years working with Inupiat communities in the Arctic. The Alutiiq people who originally inhabited this island understood something that modern visitors often forget, she said, her voice carrying the weight of years spent documenting traditional ecological knowledge. They knew that when you enter bear country, you become part of the food web. You're not an observer, you're a participant. The morning of July 27th had begun 3 days earlier at Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport, where the 6 researchers had converged from their respective institutions. Thomas had flown in from SeaTac, carrying with him the latest underwater sampling equipment from his marine biology lab at the University of Washington. His research focused on the impact of climate change on North Pacific marine ecosystems, and Afognak Island offered him the opportunity to study how warming ocean temperatures were affecting the salmon populations that formed the foundation of the region's entire ecological pyramid. Emily had driven up the Alaska Highway from her veterinary practice in Spokane, her truck loaded with specialized medical equipment and tranquilizer supplies, just in case their expedition encountered injured wildlife that required immediate intervention. Her expertise in large mammal physiology had made her an invaluable consultant for wildlife management agencies throughout the Pacific Northwest, and she approached every wilderness expedition with the dual perspective of someone who both studied animals and worked to heal them. Marcus had arrived with 3 cases of camera equipment, including a state-of-the-art telephoto lens that had cost more than most people's cars. His assignment for National Geographic involved documenting the behavioral interactions between Kodiak brown bears and salmon during the peak of the spawning season. His editor had specifically requested images that would showcase the raw power and surprising grace of these massive predators as they engaged in one of nature's most fundamental relationships. Sarah had taken the Alaska Marine Highway ferry system from Bellingham, Washington, bringing with her an extensive collection of botanical sampling equipment and preservation materials. Her multi-year study of temperate rainforest succession patterns on Alaska's coastal islands required precise documentation of plant communities at various stages of ecological development. And Afognak Island represented a unique opportunity to observe these processes in an environment with minimal human disturbance. Jake had flown in from Denver, where he ran a wilderness survival school that had trained everyone from military special forces to Hollywood actors preparing for outdoor adventure films. His reputation for keeping clients safe in extreme environments had made him the obvious choice to lead their expedition's logistics and safety protocols. He carried with him decades of experience in environments ranging from the Hindu Kush to the Amazon basin, but he developed a particular expertise in the unique challenges posed by Alaska's coastal wilderness. Rebecca had arrived from Fairbanks, where her office at the University of Alaska housed one of the world's most comprehensive collections of traditional ecological knowledge from Arctic and subarctic indigenous communities. Her research had taken her from Greenland to Siberia, documenting how traditional hunting and gathering practices represented sophisticated forms of environmental management that modern science was only beginning to appreciate. The charter flight from Kodiak to Afognak Island had taken 45 minutes aboard a de Havilland Beaver float plane piloted by Captain Roy Magnuson, a 54-year-old veteran of Alaska's bush pilot community who'd been flying these waters for over 3 decades. His weathered face, lined by years of squinting into Arctic sunlight and midnight sun, had remained impassive as he'd briefed them on the island's unique challenges. Afognak Island covers approximately 698 square miles, Magnuson had explained over the drone of the aircraft's engine, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone who'd delivered similar briefings hundreds of times. The terrain includes everything from sea-level beaches to peaks reaching 2,500 feet above sea level. The weather can change from clear skies to 50-knot winds and zero visibility in less than an hour. But the real thing you need to understand is that this island supports one of the densest populations of brown bears anywhere in North America. We are talking about potentially 200 bears on an island smaller than Rhode Island. He'd pointed out the window toward the island's eastern shore, where deep fjords cut inland like massive fingers. Your base camp location at Afognak River puts you right in the middle of the main salmon spawning corridor. During this time of year, you might encounter anywhere from 5 to 15 bears within a single day's hiking. These aren't animals that have learned to fear humans. This island has been largely uninhabited since the 1980s, which means these bears don't associate people with danger. The float plane had touched down on the protected waters of Seal Bay at 3:47 p.m. on July 27th. The pontoons sending spray across the calm surface as Magnuson expertly maneuvered toward the narrow beach that would serve as their insertion point. The water was a deep green-blue that spoke to its glacial origins, so clear that they could see salmon swimming in schools 20 feet below the surface. The beach itself consisted of smooth stones worn round by centuries of tidal action, mixed with the massive drift logs that storms had deposited far above the high tide line. As they'd unloaded their equipment, the silence of the wilderness had struck them all with an almost physical force. After years of working in environments where human activity created a constant background hum, the absolute quiet of Afognak Island had felt almost oppressive. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of water against the beach, the distant cry of bald eagles, and the subtle rustle of wind through the forest canopy that rose like a green wall just beyond the beach. Their first evening's camp had been established according to Jake's strict protocols, with their sleeping area located at least 100 yards upwind from their cooking and food storage site. The bear-proof containers, mandated by Alaska Department of Fish and Game regulations, had been positioned in a triangular formation that would allow for multiple escape routes if bears approached during the night. Each team member had been assigned specific responsibilities. Thomas and Emily were responsible for water purification and camp hygiene. Marcus handled photographic documentation of their daily progress. Sarah maintained detailed records of all plant species encountered. Jake oversaw safety protocols and emergency communications, and Rebecca documented their interactions with the environment from an anthropological perspective. The evening meal had consisted of freeze-dried camping food, supplemented by fresh salmon that Jake had caught using traditional methods he'd learned from Tlingit fishermen. As they'd sat around their camp stove, open fires were prohibited due to forest fire risk. The conversation had turned to their individual research goals and how their different disciplines might complement each other over the coming week. The beauty of an expedition like this, Thomas had observed, stirring his reconstituted beef stroganoff, is how interconnected everything becomes. The marine environment I'm studying provides the salmon that feeds Sarah's forest ecosystem, which supports the bear populations that Rebecca's indigenous sources have been managing sustainably for thousands of years, while Emily's veterinary expertise helps us understand the health dynamics of the entire system. Sarah had nodded enthusiastically, pulling out her field notebook to show them photographs of plants she'd identified just during their brief afternoon reconnaissance. I've already documented 14 species of bryophytes and 17 vascular plants that show clear adaptations to the unique soil chemistry created by salmon carcasses decomposing in the forest. It's a perfect example of how marine nutrients subsidize terrestrial ecosystems. Marcus had been reviewing the images on his camera's LCD screen, pausing occasionally to show them particularly striking shots. From a visual storytelling perspective, what's fascinating is how the landscape itself tells the story of predator-prey relationships. You can see bear trails worn into the vegetation, claw marks on trees, and even the specific locations where bears have been fishing based on the scatter patterns of salmon bones and scales. Jake had remained focused on more practical concerns, periodically checking his satellite communicator and reviewing the weather forecast data. Tomorrow's conditions look ideal for our first major hiking day. Partly cloudy with temperatures in the mid-60s and winds from the southwest at 5 to 10 knots. But I want everyone to remember that bear activity peaks during the early morning and late afternoon hours, which coincides with our planned hiking schedule. Rebecca had been documenting their conversation using a digital recorder, but she'd also been taking handwritten notes in a field journal. Traditional Alutiiq hunters would never have camped this close to a major salmon stream without posting constant watches, she'd observed. Their oral histories describe bears as beings that demand absolute respect and constant vigilance. They believed that bears could sense human emotions, particularly fear and aggression, from considerable distances. The first night had passed without incident, though Jake's motion-activated trail cameras had recorded at least 3 separate bear encounters within 200 yards of their campsite. The infrared images, reviewed the next morning over instant coffee and granola bars, showed 2 subadult bears and 1 massive adult that Jake estimated at over 800 pounds based on its track measurements in the mud near their water source. "This is actually encouraging data," Emily had explained, studying the images with her veterinarian's eye for animal behavior. "These bears are displaying normal foraging behavior patterns without any signs of aggression or unusual interest in our presence. The subadults in particular are showing classic avoidance behaviors. They're investigating our scent trails, but maintaining safe distances." July 28th had dawned clear and cold, with temperatures in the low 40s and visibility extending for miles across the island's mountainous interior. Their planned route would take them 4.2 miles up the Afognak River Trail to a series of waterfalls where salmon congregated in particularly high concentrations. The elevation gain was modest, approximately 800 feet over the course of the day, but the terrain included several creek crossings and sections where the trail disappeared entirely into dense alder thickets. Thomas had been particularly excited about the opportunity to collect water samples from the various pools and tributaries they'd encountered during the day's hike. His sampling protocol required precise pH measurements, dissolved oxygen readings, and temperature data from at least 20 different locations along their route. "The data we collect today will provide baseline measurements that future researchers can use to track long-term changes in water chemistry," he'd explained while calibrating his digital water quality meter. "Climate change is already affecting stream temperatures throughout Alaska, and this kind of longitudinal data is absolutely critical for understanding ecosystem responses." The morning's hike had proceeded according to plan, with the group making steady progress along a well-defined bear trail that paralleled the river. Sarah had stopped frequently to document plant communities, while Marcus had captured hundreds of images of the pristine wilderness landscape. The forest itself was a testament to the power of salmon-derived nutrients, with individual Sitka spruces reaching heights of over 150 feet and diameters exceeding 4 feet. The understory was dominated by devil's club, salmonberry, and various fern species that created an almost impenetrable green carpet beneath the canopy. Their first bear encounter of the day had occurred at approximately 11:30 a.m., when they'd rounded a bend in the trail to discover a large sow with 2 cubs feeding on salmon carcasses in a shallow pool approximately 60 yards ahead. Jake had immediately signaled for the group to stop and slowly back away, while Marcus had carefully documented the encounter with his telephoto lens from a safe distance. "Classic maternal behavior," Emily had whispered, observing the sow's posture and movements through binoculars. "She's aware of our presence, but not perceiving us as a direct threat." Notice how she's positioned herself between us and the cubs, and how she's continuing to feed while maintaining visual contact with our location. The encounter had lasted approximately 20 minutes, during which time the bears had continued their normal feeding behavior, while the research team had documented everything from maternal teaching behaviors to fishing techniques employed by the cubs. Rebecca had been particularly interested in the way the sow had selected specific fishing locations, demonstrating what appeared to be sophisticated knowledge of salmon behavior patterns and water flow dynamics. When the bears had finally moved upstream, the team had been able to approach the fishing site to examine the physical evidence of their feeding activity. Jake had pointed out the distinctive claw marks in the soft mud of the riverbank, which he'd measured and photographed for later analysis. Based on the size of these tracks, I'd estimate the sow at approximately 600 pounds, he'd observed. The front paw print measures 8.5 inches long by 6 inches wide, which puts her in the upper size range for breeding females in this population. Sabine, the afternoon portion of their hike, had taken them through increasingly rugged terrain as the river valley narrowed and the gradient became steeper. They'd encountered several more bears at a distance, including a massive boar that Thomas had estimated at over 1,000 pounds based on its shoulder height and body proportions. Each encounter had been carefully documented and reported via satellite communicator to the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, as required by their research permits. Their second night's camp had been established at a location Jake had selected based on topographical considerations and wind patterns. The site was positioned on a slight elevation above the river, with clear sight lines in all directions and multiple escape routes if bears approached during the night. The bear-proof food containers had been positioned even further from the sleeping area than the previous night, and Jake had established a rotation schedule for maintaining watch duties throughout the night. The bear activity we've documented today suggests that we're in the heart of their core habitat area, Jake had explained during their evening briefing. The density of sign, tracks, scat, feeding areas, daybeds indicates that multiple bears are using this corridor on a daily basis. We need to assume that our presence has been noted by every bear within a 2-mile radius. The evening meal had been interrupted by the sound of a large animal moving through the forest approximately 100 yards from their location. Jake had immediately activated his high-powered spotlight, which had illuminated the distinctive humped silhouette of a massive brown bear moving parallel to their position. The animal had paused momentarily when the light struck it, its small eyes reflecting the beam with an almost supernatural intensity, before disappearing into the darkness with surprising grace for such a large animal. "That's the same boar we encountered this afternoon," Emily had observed, studying the animal's gait and posture through night vision binoculars. "He's displaying typical reconnaissance behavior, investigating our location without showing any signs of aggressive intent. This is actually normal behavior for a dominant male during salmon season." The night had passed, with several more bear encounters recorded by the motion-activated cameras, but none of the animals had approached closer than 50 yards to their sleeping area. Jake's experience in similar environments had taught him that bears were generally curious about human presence without being immediately aggressive, particularly when they had access to abundant natural food sources like the salmon runs. July 29th had dawned with ominous changes in the weather pattern. The clear skies of the previous 2 days had given way to low-hanging clouds and a steady drizzle that reduced visibility and created treacherous conditions on the rocky sections of their planned route. The temperature had dropped into the upper 30s, and the constant moisture had made everything slippery and difficult to navigate. Jake had expressed concerns about proceeding with their planned route to the waterfall area, But the team's research schedules had created pressure to maintain their original itinerary. Thomas needed to complete his water sampling protocol at the upstream locations, while Sarah required botanical specimens from the unique plant communities that existed only in the spray zones around the waterfalls. Marcus had been commissioned specifically to photograph bears fishing in the dramatic setting provided by the cascading water, and Rebecca needed to complete her documentation of traditional fishing sites that indigenous communities had used for generations. The weather conditions increase our risk profile significantly, Jake had warned during their morning safety briefing. Reduced visibility means shorter reaction times if we encounter bears at close range, and the wet conditions make it difficult to move quickly if we need to retreat from a dangerous situation. I'm recommending that we modify our route to avoid the most hazardous sections. However, the scientific value of their research objectives had ultimately overridden safety concerns, and the team had departed camp at 8:15 a.m. under increasingly deteriorating conditions. The trail had become a muddy quagmire that slowed their progress and made it difficult to maintain proper noise discipline, one of the most important safety protocols when traveling in bear country. The morning's progress had been marked by an increasing density of bear sign, including fresh tracks in the mud that indicated multiple animals had used the trail within the previous few hours. Sarah had documented several trees with fresh claw marks reaching heights of over 8 feet, suggesting the presence of exceptionally large bears in the immediate area. The scratching patterns on these trees indicate territorial marking behavior, Rebecca had explained, comparing the claw marks to photographs in her research files. Traditional Alutiiq hunters recognized these signs as warnings that they were entering the core territory of a dominant bear. They would often turn back rather than risk a confrontation. At approximately 10:45 a.m., the team had reached a creek crossing where the trail forked, with one branch following the main river toward the waterfalls and another heading up a steep ravine that provided access to the high alpine areas. Jake had been studying the topographical map when Marcus had suddenly frozen, pointing toward a grove of alders approximately 30 yards upstream. Through the misty drizzle, they could make out the massive brown form of a bear, unlike any they had encountered during their expedition. The animal stood at least 4 feet at the shoulder, even while on all fours, with the distinctive silver-tipped coat that identified it as an exceptionally mature boar. Its head was disproportionately large even for a brown bear, with small ears that seemed almost comically undersized compared to its massive skull. "That's the largest bear I've ever seen in the field," Emily had whispered, her voice carrying a mixture of awe and professional concern. "Based on his physical proportions, I'd estimate his weight at close to 1,200 pounds. That puts him in the upper 5% of recorded Kodiak bear weights." The bear had been engaged in feeding behavior, using its massive claws to tear apart a fallen log in search of insects and larvae. Its movements displayed the casual power of an animal that had no predators and few challenges in its environment. Each swipe of its claws removed chunks of wood the size of dinner plates, and its breathing was audible even at their distance. Marcus had been carefully documenting the encounter with his telephoto lens, capturing images that would later be described by wildlife experts as some of the finest photographs ever taken of a wild Kodiak bear in its natural habitat. The bear's coat was in perfect condition, with each individual hair clearly defined in the soft light filtering through the forest canopy. Jake had been monitoring the bear's behavior for signs of awareness of their presence, and he'd begun to notice subtle changes that concerned him. The animal had stopped its feeding behavior and was testing the air with its sensitive nose, turning its massive head in their direction. Its body language had shifted from the relaxed posture of an animal focused on foraging to the alert stance of a predator assessing a potential threat or opportunity. "We need to start backing away slowly," Jake had instructed the group. "He's detected our presence, and he's trying to decide what we represent. We want to give him plenty of space to make his own decision about how to respond." However, as they had begun to retreat, the bear had made a decision that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Instead of continuing his foraging activities or moving away from the human presence, the massive boar had begun walking directly toward their location. His gait was not the casual shamble typically associated with bears, but rather the purposeful stride of an animal that had identified something that required investigation. "This is not normal behavior," Emily had said, her veterinary training immediately recognizing the subtle signs of aggression beginning to manifest in the bear's posture. His ears are beginning to lay back against his skull, and his head is lowering into an offensive position. He's not just curious, he's beginning to display predatory behavior patterns. The bear had covered the first 10 yards of distance between them with deceptive speed, his massive body moving through the undergrowth with an efficiency that contradicted his size. Jake had immediately activated his bear spray, checking the wind direction to ensure that the chemical deterrent would be effective if deployed. The canister contained a concentrated capsicum formula specifically designed for use against large aggressive mammals, with an effective range of approximately 25 feet. Thomas had been frozen in place, his scientific training warring with his survival instincts as he watched one of nature's most powerful predators approaching their group. His rational mind was cataloging details: the bear's gait pattern, the condition of its coat, the size of its claws, while his emotional mind was screaming warnings about the immediate danger they faced. Sarah had been backing away while attempting to continue her documentation, her field notebook clutched in one hand while she fumbled for her own bear spray with the other. Her years of field research had included encounters with black bears and smaller brown bears, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for the sheer physical presence of a mature Kodiak boar. Rebecca had been mentally reviewing everything she knew about traditional indigenous responses to bear encounters, but the oral histories she had documented focused primarily on hunting scenarios rather than unexpected close-range encounters. The Alutiiq hunters would have been armed with harpoons and spears specifically designed for large game, and they would have been traveling in larger groups with coordinated response protocols. The bear had continued its approach, closing the distance to approximately 20 yards when it had paused to rear up on its hind legs. Standing upright, the animal had revealed its true size, nearly 9 feet tall, with a chest breadth that exceeded that of a professional bodybuilder. Its dark brown eyes had fixed on the group with an intelligence that had seemed almost human in its intensity. "He's trying to get a better scent reading," Jake had explained, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "This is still investigative behavior, but we're right at the threshold where it could shift to aggressive action. Everyone stay calm and continue backing away slowly." Marcus had continued photographing, his professional instincts overriding his survival reflexes as he captured what would later be recognized as some of the most dramatic wildlife photography ever recorded. The images showed the massive bear in perfect detail, its silver-tipped fur gleaming with moisture from the constant drizzle, its powerful muscles clearly defined beneath its thick coat. The bear had dropped back to all fours and resumed its approach, but its pace had accelerated, and its body language had shifted unmistakably toward aggressive intent. Its massive head had lowered until its chin was almost touching the ground, while its shoulder hump, the distinctive anatomical feature that distinguished brown bears from their smaller black bear cousins, had become more pronounced as the animal's muscles tensed for action. "He's made his decision," Jake had said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced dangerous wildlife throughout his career. "Everyone needs to prepare for a charge." Do not run. That will trigger his chase response. Stand your ground, make yourselves look as large as possible, and be ready to use your bear spray. Emily had positioned herself slightly ahead of the others, her veterinary background giving her a detailed understanding of bear anatomy and physiology that might prove crucial in the next few minutes. She had identified the optimal target areas for bear spray deployment and had calculated the wind speed and direction to maximize the effectiveness of their chemical deterrents. Thomas had been struggling with the counterintuitive nature of standing his ground in the face of a charging predator, every evolutionary instinct screaming at him to flee. His scientific training had provided him with detailed knowledge of bear behavior, but academic understanding proved wholly inadequate preparation for the reality of facing 1,200 pounds of predator at close range. The charge had begun without warning, the massive bear accelerating from a walking pace to full sprint in less than 2 seconds. The sound of its approach, the thundering of massive paws against the soft earth, the huffing of its breathing, the crackling of vegetation being crushed beneath its weight, had created a sensory assault that had overwhelmed the group's ability to respond effectively. Jake had deployed his bear spray when the animal had closed to within 15 feet, the chemical stream forming a visible cloud in the moist air. The capsicum-based deterrent had struck the bear directly in the face, but rather than deterring the animal, it had seemed to enrage it further. The bear had shaken its massive head and continued its charge, its small eyes now streaming with tears from the chemical irritant. The impact when the bear had reached their position had been unlike anything any of them had experienced or imagined. The animal's momentum had been such that it had knocked Jake completely off his feet before he could deploy a second burst of spray. The guide's extensive survival training had not prepared him for the reality of being struck by a force equivalent to a small automobile traveling at 30 miles per hour. Emily had managed to discharge her own bear spray just as the animal had turned toward her, but the wet conditions had reduced the effectiveness of the chemical cloud. The bear's massive paw had struck her across the chest with enough force to lift her completely off the ground and send her flying backward into a cluster of devil's club plants. The sound of her impact, a combination of breaking branches and expelled breath, had been audible even over the bear's vocalizations. Thomas had found himself face to face with the massive predator as it had turned toward him after dispatching Emily. The bear's breath had been hot and fetid, carrying the scent of partially digested salmon and the metallic tang of fresh blood. Its jaws, capable of crushing a moose femur, had been mere inches from his face as he had fumbled desperately for his bear spray. The canister had finally come free from his pack, just as the bear's jaws had clamped down on his left shoulder. The pressure had been indescribable. Not sharp like a knife wound, but crushing, like being caught in industrial machinery. He had felt his collarbone snap under the pressure, followed by the grinding sensation of the bear's teeth penetrating muscle and scraping against bone. Marcus had been attempting to photograph the encounter, even as it had unfolded, his professional instincts overriding his survival reflexes, until the moment when the bear had released Thomas and turned toward him. The camera's motor drive had continued firing as the massive predator had knocked him to the ground, the final images in the sequence showing nothing but a blur of brown fur and the massive cavern of the animal's mouth. Sarah had managed to back away from the initial attack, but her retreat had been blocked by a fallen log that had trapped her in a small clearing with no escape route. She had watched in horror as the bear had systematically attacked each member of their group, its movements displaying a level of calculated aggression that suggested this was not merely defensive behavior, but active predation. Rebecca had attempted to climb a nearby Sitka spruce, but the wet bark had provided insufficient grip for her to ascend beyond the bear's reach. The animal had reared up on its hind legs and pulled her down with a casual swipe of its claws. the razor-sharp talons opening 4 parallel gashes across her back that had penetrated through her rain jacket and fleece layers to the muscle beneath. The attack had lasted approximately 4 minutes, an eternity for those experiencing it, but barely a moment in the context of the wilderness day. When it had ended, the massive bear had stood among the scattered remains of their expedition, breathing heavily but showing no signs of fatigue or injury despite the multiple chemical deterrent deployments it had absorbed. Jake had been the first to regain consciousness, his survival training allowing him to assess the situation even through the haze of shock and injury. His left arm had been nearly severed at the shoulder, held in place only by strips of muscle and tendon, while multiple rib fractures made breathing an exercise in agony. The taste of blood in his mouth suggested internal injuries that would require immediate medical intervention if he was to survive. Emily had been conscious but unable to move, her veterinary training allowing her to perform a rapid self-assessment of her injuries. The bear's initial strike had crushed several ribs and potentially damaged her spleen, while the impact with the Devil's Club had opened multiple lacerations across her face and hands. Most concerning was the sharp pain in her abdomen that suggested internal bleeding, a condition that would prove fatal without surgical intervention within hours. Thomas had been semi-conscious, his scientific mind cataloguing the extent of his injuries, even as his body went into shock. The bear's bite had crushed his left clavicle and damaged the brachial plexus, leaving his left arm completely numb and useless. Multiple puncture wounds from the animal's canine teeth had created channels for potential infection, while blood loss from the damaged subclavian artery was creating an increasingly critical situation. Marcus had been unconscious, his body positioned at an unnatural angle that suggested spinal trauma. The bear's attack had focused on his torso and head, creating a pattern of injuries that would challenge even the most experienced trauma surgeons. His expensive camera equipment lay scattered around his position, the lenses shattered, and the camera body showing clear evidence of having been stepped on by something weighing over half a ton. Sarah had managed to avoid the worst of the attack by remaining motionless after her initial retreat, but she had sustained significant injuries when the bear had investigated her position. Deep claw marks across her legs had severed muscle groups and potentially damaged the femoral artery, while a bite wound to her right arm had crushed the radius and ulnar bones. Her field notebook, somehow still clutched in her left hand, was stained with blood, but continued to serve as a focus point for her consciousness. Rebecca had been partially conscious, her anthropological training allowing her to observe and document even her own traumatic experience. The claw wounds across her back had been painful but not immediately life-threatening, while a bite wound to her left thigh had created a crushing injury that would require extensive surgical reconstruction. Her digital recorder, activated by accident during the attack, had captured the entire encounter in horrifying detail. The massive bear had remained in the area for approximately 15 minutes after the attack, investigating each member of the group and occasionally returning to individuals who showed signs of movement. Its behavior had been consistent with that of a predator securing a kill site, marking territory and ensuring that no threats remained to challenge its possession of the area. When the animal had finally departed, moving upstream toward the waterfall area with the same purposeful gait it had displayed during its approach, the survivors had found themselves alone in the Alaskan wilderness with injuries that would prove fatal without immediate rescue. Jake's satellite communicator had been damaged during the attack, its antenna bent and its display screen cracked, but he had managed to activate its emergency beacon function. The device had transmitted their GPS coordinates and an automated distress signal to the Alaska Rescue Coordination Center in Anchorage, initiating what would become one of the largest wilderness rescue operations in Alaska state history. The rescue beacon's signal had been received at 11:23 a.m., approximately 8 minutes after the bear attack had concluded. The Alaska Rescue Coordination Center had immediately dispatched 2 HH-60 Jayhawk helicopters from Coast Guard Air Station Kodiak, while simultaneously alerting the Alaska Department of Public Safety and the Alaska National Guard. The rescue operation had been complicated by the deteriorating weather conditions, which had reduced visibility to less than half a mile and created dangerous turbulence conditions for helicopter operations. Coast Guard rescue swimmer Senior Chief Petty Officer Daniel Murphy, a 15-year veteran of Alaska Maritime Rescues, had been aboard the first helicopter to reach the attack site. His experience included rescues from sinking fishing vessels in the Bering Sea and emergency medical evacuations from remote villages throughout the Aleutian Islands, but he had never encountered the level of trauma that awaited him at the Afognak Island attack site. "The scene was unlike anything I'd encountered in my career," Murphy would later testify during the official investigation. "We had 6 individuals with massive trauma injuries scattered across approximately 50 yards of forest floor, with evidence of predator activity throughout the area. The bear had clearly remained at the site for an extended period after the attack, and we could see fresh tracks indicating that it might still be in the immediate vicinity." The helicopter insertion had been complicated by the dense forest canopy, which had prevented the aircraft from landing near the attack site. Murphy and Flight Paramedic Staff Sergeant Lisa Rodriguez had been forced to rappel through the trees, bringing with them the emergency medical equipment necessary to stabilize multiple critical trauma patients. Rodriguez, a combat medic veteran of 3 deployments to Afghanistan, had immediately begun triage procedures to determine which patients required the most immediate attention. Her battlefield experience had taught her to prioritize patients based on survivability rather than severity of injuries, and she had quickly identified Jake and Emily as having the best chances of survival if they received immediate medical intervention. The injuries were consistent with large animal predation, Rodriguez would later explain to investigators. Multiple crushing wounds, tissue avulsion, and massive blood loss. The pattern suggested a single large predator rather than multiple animals, and the size of the bite marks indicated something significantly larger than typical brown bear encounters. Jake had been the first patient extracted, his survival training and physical conditioning having given him the best chances of surviving the helicopter flight to definitive medical care. The flight medics had been able to establish intravenous access and begin fluid resuscitation during the 15-minute flight to Kodiak Regional Hospital, but his condition had remained critical throughout the transport. Emily had been extracted on the second helicopter run, her veterinary background allowing her to provide her own medical history and medication allergies even while in shock. The medical team had been particularly concerned about potential internal bleeding, and they had been able to establish 2 large-bore IV lines to support her blood pressure during transport. Thomas had been conscious during his extraction, his scientific training allowing him to observe and document his own rescue even while experiencing severe trauma. He had provided detailed information about the attack timeline and bear behavior patterns that would prove crucial for both the medical team and the subsequent wildlife investigation. Marcus had required the most complex extraction, his spinal injuries necessitating careful stabilization procedures before he could be moved. The rescue team had been forced to cut away several tree branches to create adequate clearance for the rescue basket while maintaining spinal immobilization throughout the process. Sarah and Rebecca had been evacuated together on the final helicopter run, their less critical injuries allowing the medical team to treat them as lower priority patients. However, both women had lost significant amounts of blood, and their conditions had deteriorated during the extended wait for extraction. Kodiak Regional Hospital had activated its mass casualty protocols upon notification of the incoming patients, with trauma surgeon Dr. Michael Patterson coordinating the hospital's response. Patterson, a former military surgeon who had served in Iraq, had experience with complex trauma cases, but the unique nature of bear attack injuries had presented challenges that differed significantly from combat casualties. Bear attack injuries create a specific pattern of trauma that combines massive crushing forces with tissue avulsion and potential infection from bacteria in the animal's mouth, Patterson would later explain. The treatment protocol requires immediate surgical intervention to control bleeding, followed by extensive debridement to remove contaminated tissue and prevent necrotizing infections. Jake's surgery had lasted 7 hours, during which time the surgical team had been forced to amputate his left arm at the shoulder due to irreparable damage to the brachial plexus and massive tissue loss. Additional procedures had been required to repair internal injuries to his spleen and liver, while orthopedic surgeons had reconstructed his crushed rib cage using titanium plates and screws. Emily's injuries had required immediate exploratory surgery to identify and repair internal bleeding. The surgical team had discovered a grade 4 splenic laceration that had required spleen removal, while her crushed ribs had punctured her left lung, necessitating emergency thoracic surgery. Her facial lacerations had required plastic surgery reconstruction that would continue for months after her initial hospitalization. Thomas had undergone emergency surgery to repair damage to his subclavian artery and reconstruct his crushed clavicle. The bear's bite had severed multiple muscle groups and damaged nerve pathways that would require extensive rehabilitation to restore even partial function. Plastic surgeons had been required to close the massive puncture wounds left by the animal's canine teeth. Marcus had been airlifted to Providence, Alaska Medical Center in Anchorage for specialized neurosurgical intervention. His spinal injuries had been stabilized, but doctors had been unable to determine the extent of neurological damage until the swelling in his spinal cord had decreased. He had remained unconscious for 6 days following the attack, requiring mechanical ventilation and intensive monitoring. Sarah's injuries had been primarily orthopedic, requiring extensive surgery to repair the crushed bones in her right arm and reconstruct damaged muscle groups in her legs. The femoral artery damage had been successfully repaired, but circulation problems had persisted for weeks after the initial surgery. Her field notebook, recovered from the attack site, had provided valuable documentation of plant species encountered during their expedition. Rebecca's injuries had been the least severe of the group, but she had still required multiple surgeries to close the claw wounds across her back and reconstruct damaged muscle tissue in her thigh. Her digital recorder, found still running at the attack site, had provided investigators with a minute-by-minute audio record of the attack and its aftermath. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game had immediately launched an investigation into the attack, led by area wildlife biologist Dr. Jennifer Hayes and enforcement officer Captain Robert Sterling. Their investigation had focused on identifying the specific bear responsible for the attack and determining whether it posed a continued threat to public safety. Hayes, who held a Ph.D. in wildlife biology from the University of Alaska Fairbanks and had spent 12 years studying brown bear behavior throughout the state, had never encountered an attack of this severity. The behavioral patterns displayed by this animal were consistent with predatory rather than defensive aggression, she would later testify. This was not a case of surprising a bear or getting between a sow and her cubs. This was active predation by a mature male bear. The investigation team had returned to the attack site within 24 hours, accompanied by Alaska State Troopers and armed wildlife enforcement officers. They had discovered extensive physical evidence of the attack, including claw marks on trees, massive paw prints in the soft earth, and scattered equipment from the research expedition. Hair samples collected from torn clothing and broken tree branches had been submitted for DNA analysis to identify the specific individual responsible for the attack. The genetic testing, conducted at the Alaska Department of Fish and Game's Wildlife Genetics Laboratory in Anchorage, had confirmed that a single large male bear had been responsible for all the injuries sustained by the research team. Measurements of paw prints found at the scene had confirmed earlier estimates of the bear's size, with front paw prints measuring 11.5 inches long by 8.5 inches wide, dimensions that placed the animal in the upper 2% of recorded Kodiak bear sizes. Wildlife biologists had estimated the bear's weight at between 1,200 and 1,400 pounds, making it one of the largest brown bears ever documented in Alaska. The search for the specific bear had involved multiple agencies and extended over 6 days, using helicopters equipped with infrared sensors and teams of tracking dogs specially trained for dangerous wildlife situations. The operation had been complicated by the island's dense forest cover and the large number of bears present in the area during salmon season. On August 4th, 6 days after the attack, wildlife officers had located and destroyed a large male brown bear approximately 2 miles upstream from the attack site. DNA analysis of tissue samples had confirmed that this was the animal responsible for the July 29th attack. The bear's remains had been transported to the Alaska Department of Fish and Game Laboratory in Anchorage for detailed forensic examination. The necropsy had revealed that the bear had been in excellent health, with no signs of disease, injury, or malnutrition that might have explained its aggressive behavior toward humans. Stomach contents had included salmon, berries, and plant material consistent with normal brown bear diet, with no evidence of previous human contact or garbage consumption. Dr. Hayes had concluded that the attack had resulted from a combination of factors including the bear's exceptional size and dominant status, optimal physical condition during peak salmon season, and territorial behavior in response to human presence in its core habitat area. This was an apex predator defending what it perceived as its territory against intruders, she had explained. The bear's behavior was aberrant from a human perspective, but entirely consistent with the behavioral patterns of a dominant male brown bear in prime habitat. Media coverage of the attack had been extensive, with news organizations from throughout North America sending reporters to Alaska to cover the story. The dramatic nature of the attack, combined with the research team's academic credentials and the availability of high-quality photographs taken during the encounter, had created a media sensation that had persisted for weeks. The New York Times had published a front-page story titled "When Science Meets Nature's Ultimate Predator," while National Geographic had produced a television documentary examining the attack from both human and wildlife perspectives. Marcus's photographs, recovered from his damaged camera equipment, had been published worldwide and had won numerous journalism awards. The psychological trauma experienced by the survivors had proven as challenging as their physical injuries. All 6 members of the research team had been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, with symptoms including nightmares, panic attacks, and severe anxiety related to outdoor activities. Jake had been forced to retire from wilderness guiding, his physical disabilities making it impossible for him to continue in his chosen profession. However, he had become an advocate for wilderness safety education, developing training programs that incorporated lessons learned from the Afognak Island attack. His survival school had been renamed the Afognak Institute, and had become recognized as one of the premier wilderness safety training facilities in North America. Emily had returned to her veterinary practice after 8 months of rehabilitation, but she had specialized in treating domestic animals rather than continuing her large mammal work. Her experience as both an attack survivor and a medical professional had made her a sought-after expert on animal attack trauma, and she had consulted on numerous cases throughout the Pacific Northwest. Thomas had been able to return to his marine biology research after extensive rehabilitation, but he had focused on laboratory-based studies rather than fieldwork. His detailed documentation of the attack had contributed to several scientific papers on predator-prey interactions and human-wildlife conflict management. He had received tenure at the University of Washington, based in part on his research contributions following the attack. Marcus had recovered from his spinal injuries, but had been left with permanent nerve damage that had affected his manual dexterity. He had adapted his photography techniques to accommodate his disabilities and had produced several award-winning documentary projects about wildlife conservation and human survival. His book about the Afognak Island experience, titled Face to Face with the Ultimate Predator, had become a bestseller. Sarah had completed her rehabilitation and returned to botanical research, but she had restricted her fieldwork to areas with minimal large mammal populations. Her plant specimens collected during the expedition had contributed to several scientific publications about plant community structure in salmon-subsidized ecosystems. She had been awarded the Botanical Society of America's Merit Award for her contributions to understanding plant-animal interactions. Rebecca had incorporated her attack experience into her anthropological research, publishing several papers about traditional indigenous knowledge regarding human-bear interactions. Her audio recording of the attack had become a valuable resource for researchers studying bear vocalization patterns and aggressive behavior sequences. She had received the American Anthropological Association's Franz Boas Award for her work documenting traditional ecological knowledge. The legal proceedings following the attack had been complex, involving questions of liability, insurance coverage, and regulatory compliance. The expedition had been properly permitted and had followed all required safety protocols, which had limited potential legal challenges. However, several lawsuits had been filed against equipment manufacturers whose products had failed during the attack. The bear spray manufacturer had faced particular scrutiny, as multiple canisters had failed to deter the attacking bear despite being deployed correctly under appropriate conditions. Laboratory testing had revealed that the wet conditions had reduced the effectiveness of the chemical deterrent, leading to improved formulations designed for use in high-humidity environments. The investigation had also revealed gaps in existing wilderness safety protocols, particularly regarding communication equipment and emergency response procedures. New regulations had been implemented requiring redundant communication systems for research expeditions in high-risk areas, while emergency response protocols had been updated based on lessons learned during the rescue operation. The long-term impact of the Afognak Island attack had extended far beyond the immediate victims, influencing wilderness safety practices throughout North America. The detailed documentation provided by the survivors had created an unprecedented database of information about large predator behavior and attack patterns that had informed safety protocols for researchers, guides, and recreational users. Wildlife management agencies had used the attack data to develop improved bear encounter protocols, while medical facilities had updated their trauma response procedures based on the unique injury patterns associated with large animal attacks. The psychological support services developed for the survivors had become a model for treating trauma victims from similar incidents. The research that the team had planned to conduct on Afognak Island had eventually been completed by subsequent expeditions, but with significantly enhanced safety protocols and larger support teams. The marine biology data collected by Thomas during the first 2 days of their expedition had provided valuable baseline information for long-term climate change studies, while Sarah's botanical specimens had contributed to understanding of plant community dynamics in bear habitat. The Afognak Island attack had become a case study in wildlife management programs throughout North America, illustrating both the inherent risks of fieldwork in predator habitat and the importance of comprehensive safety planning. The survivors' willingness to share their experience had contributed to improved safety outcomes for thousands of researchers and outdoor enthusiasts. Years later, the survivors would continue to gather annually on July 29th, not to commemorate their trauma, but to celebrate their survival and the contributions their experience had made to wilderness safety. Their shared experience had created bonds that transcended their professional relationships, and they had become advocates for both wildlife conservation and human safety in wilderness environments. The massive Kodiak bear that had attacked them remained in their memories not as a monster, but as a powerful reminder of humanity's place in the natural world. Their encounter had been a collision between human ambition and natural forces that operated according to rules far older than civilization, and their survival had been a testament to both human resilience and the unpredictable nature of the wilderness they had chosen to study. The island itself continued its eternal cycles, with salmon returning each summer to spawn in the same rivers where the attack had occurred, and brown bears continuing to fish in the pools where 6 researchers had nearly lost their lives. The forest had reclaimed the site of their encounter, with new growth covering the scars left by that terrible morning. But the lessons learned from their experience would continue to protect others who ventured into the domain of North America's largest land predator. The story of the Afognak Island attack would be told and retold, serving as both a cautionary tale and an inspiration for those who studied the natural world. It was a reminder that even in an age of advanced technology and scientific understanding, humans remained vulnerable to forces that had shaped the landscape long before the first researchers had set foot on Alaska's remote islands. In the end, the 6 survivors had achieved something that transcended their original research objectives. They had provided future generations with invaluable knowledge about the intersection of human ambition and natural power, lessons written in blood and pain, but ultimately serving to protect others who would follow in their footsteps. Their encounter with the ultimate predator had become a chapter in the larger story of humanity's relationship with the wilderness, a relationship defined by respect, caution, and the recognition that in nature's domain, humans would always be visitors rather than masters. The next stories, June 14, 2024. Grizzly bear kills 42-year-old fisherman in just 3 minutes at Yellowstone River. The morning mist hung low over the Yellowstone River like a shroud, carrying with it the scent of pine and the promise of death. Michael Anthony Reynolds, 42 years old, stood waist-deep in the icy current at 6:47 a.m., his weathered hands working the fly rod with the practiced precision of a man who had spent the better part of 2 decades pursuing trout in these very waters. The Montana wilderness stretched endlessly around him, a cathedral of stone and timber that had claimed more souls than any man-made structure ever could. He did not know that in exactly 2 hours and 38 minutes, his screams would echo off the canyon walls, and by 9:28 a.m., the Yellowstone River would run red with his blood. Michael had driven up from Bozeman the previous evening, his blue Ford F-150, loaded with camping gear and fishing equipment, the same ritual he had performed every June for the past 15 years. His wife, Sarah Elizabeth Reynolds, had kissed him goodbye at their modest ranch-style home on Maple Street, her lips tasting of coffee and concern. She had grown accustomed to these solo trips, though she never stopped worrying about the dangers that lurked in the Montana backcountry. Bears, she knew, were not the only threat. The river itself had claimed 13 lives in the past decade, its deceptively calm surface hiding treacherous currents and submerged rocks that could dash a man's skull open as easily as dropping an egg on concrete. "You be careful out there, Michael," she had whispered against his ear as they stood in their driveway, her arms wrapped around his broad shoulders. At 41, Sarah still possessed the delicate beauty that had first captured Michael's attention at the University of Montana 23 years earlier, though worry lines had begun to etch themselves around her green eyes. "The radio said there's been increased grizzly activity in the Gardner area." Michael had chuckled, his deep voice rumbling through his chest as he held her close. "Honey, I've been fishing these waters since before you knew how to bait a hook. The bears and I have an understanding." His confidence was not misplaced. Michael Reynolds was no weekend warrior or tourist angler. Born and raised in Livingston, Montana, he had grown up in the shadow of the Absaroka Range, learning to read the wilderness the way other children learned to read books. His father, Thomas Reynolds, had been a forest ranger for 34 years before retirement, and his grandfather, William Reynolds, had trapped beaver and hunted elk in these mountains when Yellowstone was still young. The wilderness was literally in Michael's blood, coded into his DNA like a genetic memory of survival and respect for the natural world. Standing now in the pre-dawn darkness beside his truck at the Gardner River access point, Michael methodically checked his gear. His tackle box, a weathered metal container that had belonged to his father, contained dozens of hand-tied flies arranged in perfect order. Woolly buggers, elk hair caddis, pale morning duns, and his personal favorite, a pattern he had developed himself called the Montana Ghost, tied with white hackle and silver tinsel that seemed to drive the native cutthroat trout into a feeding frenzy. His waders, high-quality neoprene that had cost him nearly $400, showed the scars of countless encounters with sharp rocks and deadfall. His rod, a 9-foot sage that he had saved for 8 months to purchase, felt like an extension of his own arm. The parking area at Gardner was deserted except for a single Park Service vehicle, its occupant invisible in the pre-dawn gloom. Michael had chosen this spot deliberately, knowing that the tourist crowds would not begin arriving for another 3 hours. June was peak season in Yellowstone, and by 10 a.m. the river would be lined with amateur anglers from across the country, their presence enough to spook every decent fish for miles. But now, in the sacred quiet of early morning, the river belonged to him. Michael Reynolds was a man who understood solitude, not as loneliness, but as communion with something larger than himself. As a certified public accountant, he spent 10 months of the year buried in spreadsheets and tax returns, his office on Main Street in Bozeman, a sterile environment of fluorescent lights and climate control. But here, standing on the banks of the Yellowstone River as the first rays of sunlight painted the canyon walls gold, he felt truly alive. The river spoke to him in a language older than words, its voice a symphony of current and stone that washed away the accumulated stress of modern life like baptismal water. He had been coming to this same stretch of river since he was 12 years old, first with his father and grandfather, later with college friends, and finally alone. He knew every pool, every riffle, every undercut bank where the big trout liked to hide. The river had personalities that changed with the seasons and the weather. In spring, it ran high and muddy with snowmelt, dangerous and unpredictable. In summer, it settled into a more manageable rhythm, its waters clear enough to see the rainbow trout suspended like jewels in the deeper pools. Fall brought the spawning runs, when the fish were thick and aggressive, and winter locked everything in ice and silence. But June was special. June was when the river came alive with activity, when the insect hatches were at their peak and the fish were feeding aggressively after the lean winter months. Michael had kept detailed journals of his fishing trips for over 20 years, noting water temperature, weather conditions, insect activity, and fish behavior with the methodical precision of a scientist. His record showed that June 14th had historically been one of the most productive days of the year, with water temperatures in the optimal range and a variety of insects providing steady feeding opportunities for the trout. This year's conditions looked perfect. The previous week's weather had been ideal, warm days and cool nights with no major precipitation. The water level was exactly where it should be for this time of year, and the clarity was exceptional. Michael's weather app showed clear skies with temperatures climbing from the current 42 degrees to a projected high of 78. A light breeze from the west would help with casting and keep the mosquitoes at bay. Every variable pointed to an exceptional day on the water. As he pulled on his waders in the grey pre-dawn light, Michael thought about the conversation he had had with his wife the previous evening. Sarah's concerns about bear activity were not unfounded. The Yellowstone ecosystem was home to approximately 700 grizzly bears, and their population had been steadily increasing for the past 2 decades. June was particularly dangerous because it coincided with the bears' emergence from hibernation and the beginning of their search for food. Male grizzlies, called boars, could weigh up to 800 pounds and were known to be particularly aggressive during the early summer months as they established territories and sought mates. But Michael had encountered bears before, dozens of times over the years, and had never had a serious confrontation. His father had taught him the cardinal rules of bear safety from an early age. Make noise while hiking to avoid surprising a bear. Carry bear spray and know how to use it. Never run from a bear, as this triggers their predator instincts. Stand your ground, make yourself look larger, and back away slowly. Most bears, even grizzlies, would rather avoid human contact than engage in a potentially dangerous confrontation. Michael carried a canister of bear spray on his belt, a high-concentration capsaicin formula that was effective at ranges up to 30 feet. He also wore a whistle around his neck and made it a habit to call out periodically while moving along the river. "Hey, bear!" he would shout every few hundred yards, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. It was a precaution that had served him well for decades. As he waded into the river at the first light of dawn, Michael felt the familiar shock of the cold water against his legs, even through the insulating neoprene of his waders. The Yellowstone River maintained a year-round temperature of around 50 degrees, fed by snowmelt from the high peaks and underground springs that never warmed beyond their subterranean chill. The cold was invigorating, a reminder that this was not some tame recreational lake, but a wild river that demanded respect and attention. Michael began his morning ritual of reading the water, a skill that had taken him years to develop. The river's surface told stories to those who knew how to interpret them, the subtle V-shaped wakes that indicated rocks beneath the surface, the foam lines where different currents met, concentrating insects and drawing feeding fish, the dark shadows along the banks, where large trout lurked in ambush, the dimpled rises that marked fish taking insects from the surface. To the untrained eye, the river was simply a mass of moving water. To Michael, it was a complex ecosystem alive with opportunity and danger in equal measure. He tied on a size 16 elk hair caddis, a pattern that imitated the small moths and flying ants that would be active in the early morning hours. His first cast was poetry in motion, the line unfolding in a perfect loop before settling gently on the water with barely a ripple. The fly drifted naturally with the current, and within seconds a fish rose to take it. The strike was subtle, just a slight hesitation in the drift of the line, but Michael's reflexes were honed by decades of experience. He set the hook with a quick upward motion of his rod tip and immediately felt the electric resistance of a fish on the line. The trout was a nice one, probably 14 or 15 inches, and it fought with the wild aggression that made native cutthroat trout so prized among serious anglers. It jumped twice, its silver sides flashing in the early morning light, before settling into a determined run toward the deeper water in the center of the river. Michael played it expertly, giving line when the fish demanded it, applying pressure when he sensed weakness. After 3 minutes of careful maneuvering, he brought the fish to hand, admiring its perfect proportions and vivid coloration before releasing it back to the river with a gentle twist of his wrist. "One down," he murmured to himself, making a mental note to record the catch in his journal when he returned to shore. The first fish of the day was always special, a promise that the river was alive and willing to reward patience and skill. As the morning progressed, Michael worked his way methodically upstream, covering water with the systematic approach of a professional guide. He fished every likely spot, every pool and riffle that might hold trout, varying his presentation and fly selection based on the specific conditions of each location. By 8 a.m., he had caught and released 7 fish, including a beautiful 18-inch cutthroat that had tested his skill and equipment to their limits. The sun was now fully above the canyon rim, its rays beginning to warm the valley floor and create the kind of perfect fishing conditions that Michael lived for. The water temperature was climbing toward the optimal range for insect activity, and he could see sporadic rises beginning to appear across the river's surface. A hatch was building, probably pale morning duns based on the time of year and weather conditions. In another hour, the fishing would be exceptional. Michael was so focused on the water in front of him that he failed to notice the massive paw print in the mud beside a fallen log 30 yards upstream. The print was fresh, probably made within the past hour, and measured nearly 12 inches long, with claw marks extending another 4 inches beyond the toes. Any experienced outdoorsman would have recognized it immediately as the track of a large male grizzly bear, probably weighing close to 700 pounds based on the depth of the impression in the soft earth. The bear that had made the track was indeed a mature boar, a 23-year-old male that the Park Service had designated as Bear 211. He had been fitted with a radio collar as a 2-year-old cub and had been tracked by researchers for over 2 decades. At his last capture and weighing 3 years earlier, Bear 211 had tipped the scales at 684 pounds, making him one of the largest grizzlies in the Yellowstone ecosystem. He was a veteran of the wilderness, an apex predator that had survived territorial battles with other bears, conflicts with humans, and the constant struggle for resources that defined life in the wild. Bear 211 had emerged from his winter den 6 weeks earlier, groggy and hungry after months of hibernation. Like all grizzly bears, he had lost a significant amount of weight during the winter, burning stored fat to maintain his body temperature and basic metabolic functions. He was now in a state of hyperphagia, an intense hunger that drove him to consume up to 20,000 calories per day as he rebuilt his energy reserves for the coming year. The bear had been following the Yellowstone River for the past 3 days, not hunting Michael specifically, but rather following the salmon and trout spawning runs that provided one of his primary food sources during the early summer months. Grizzly bears are opportunistic omnivores, equally at home digging for roots and berries as they are fishing for salmon or scavenging carrion. But Bear 211 had developed a particular expertise in fishing, spending hours standing in the shallows as he waited for the perfect moment to strike at passing fish with lightning reflexes. The bear's exceptional size and experience made him particularly dangerous. Unlike younger bears that might be intimidated by human presence, Bear 211 had learned to associate humans with food sources. Over the years, he had raided numerous campsites and garbage containers, developing a tolerance for human scent that had brought him into conflict with park rangers on multiple occasions. 3 years earlier, he had been relocated to a remote area of the park after becoming too habituated to human presence. But bears have exceptional homing abilities, and Bear 211 had returned to his preferred territory within a month. The morning of June 14th found Bear 211 in a particularly aggressive mood. The previous evening, he had encountered a younger male grizzly fishing in what he considered his territory. The confrontation had been brief but violent, resulting in several deep claw marks across the younger bear's shoulders and face. Such territorial disputes were common during the summer months, but they left the dominant bear in a heightened state of aggression that could persist for days. Bear 211 had caught the scent of Michael Reynolds from nearly a mile downstream. The bear's olfactory system was among the most sophisticated in the animal kingdom, capable of detecting odors from distances that would be incomprehensible to humans. He could smell the neoprene of Michael's waders, the synthetic materials of his fishing equipment, the residual scent of coffee on his breath from his morning thermos, and dozens of other human odors that painted a detailed picture of the intruder in his territory. The bear had been tracking Michael for over an hour, moving parallel to the river through the dense undergrowth that lined the banks. His massive bulk, normally a disadvantage in stealth situations, was surprisingly well suited to moving through the forest without detection. Grizzly bears are capable of incredible stealth when they choose to employ it, their padded paws making virtually no sound on the forest floor, and their brown fur providing excellent camouflage against the shadows of the trees. At 9:15 a.m., Bear 211 positioned himself in a dense thicket approximately 50 yards upstream from Michael's current location. From this vantage point, he could observe the human without being detected, studying his movements and patterns with the patient intelligence of an apex predator. The bear's small eyes, nearly hidden in the mass of fur and flesh that comprised his enormous head, tracked every motion as Michael worked his way upstream, oblivious to the danger that stalked him. Michael was completely focused on a promising pool where the river bent sharply to the left, creating a deep eddy that was perfect habitat for large trout. He had been watching the water for several minutes, noting sporadic rises that indicated fish were feeding beneath the surface. This was exactly the kind of spot where he had caught his largest fish over the years, and he could feel the familiar excitement building as he prepared to make his approach. The pool required a delicate presentation. The current was complex, with multiple streams of different speeds that would quickly create drag on his line if he was not careful. Michael studied the water for a full 5 minutes, planning his casting angle and anticipating where his fly needed to land to achieve a natural drift. He selected a size 14 pale morning dun, a pattern that closely matched the insects he could see beginning to emerge from the water's surface. His first cast was perfect, the line shooting out in a narrow loop before settling gently on the water, with the fly landing exactly where he had intended. The artificial insect drifted naturally with the current, indistinguishable from the real mayflies that were beginning to emerge in increasing numbers. Michael watched the fly intently, ready to set the hook at the first sign of a take. The strike, when it came, was explosive. The fish hit the fly with such violence that it created a visible splash on the water's surface, and Michael felt the immediate shock of connection as his rod bent nearly double under the strain. This was no ordinary trout. The fish that had taken his fly was easily the largest he had ever hooked, probably a cutthroat in the 24 to 26-inch range. A true trophy that might weigh 4 or 5 pounds. The fish immediately began a powerful run toward the deep water in the center of the pool, stripping line from Michael's reel with a high-pitched whining sound. Michael applied as much pressure as he dared, but the fish was incredibly strong, and he was forced to follow it downstream to avoid breaking his tippet. The battle moved from the pool into the faster water below, where the current added its own pressure to the equation and made playing the fish even more challenging. For 15 minutes, Michael and the fish engaged in a test of wills and skill that represented everything he loved about fly fishing. The trout jumped repeatedly, each leap a spectacular display of wild power and grace that took Michael's breath away. Between jumps, the fish used the current to its advantage, turning sideways and letting the river's flow multiply the pressure on Michael's line and rod. It was a masterful display of survival instincts, the product of millions of years of evolution that had honed these fish into perfect fighting machines. Michael was so completely absorbed in the battle that he failed to notice Bear 211 moving closer through the willows that lined the riverbank. The bear had been watching the fishing exhibition with growing interest, not because he cared about the outcome of the fight, but because the commotion was drawing his attention to the human's exact location and state of distraction. The splash of the jumping fish, the excited movements of the angler, and the focused concentration that blocked out all other awareness had created the perfect opportunity for an ambush. At 9:23 a.m., just as Michael was beginning to gain the upper hand in his battle with the giant trout, Bear 211 made his move. The bear emerged from the willows with shocking suddenness, his 700-pound bulk covering the 30 yards to the water's edge in less than 10 seconds. Grizzly bears are capable of running at speeds up to 35 miles per hour, and their acceleration is phenomenal. One moment the riverbank appeared empty, and the next moment it was filled with an avalanche of fur, muscle, and razor-sharp claws moving with terrifying purpose. Michael's first indication of danger was not visual, but auditory. The sound of the bear's approach was unlike anything in his experience, a combination of heavy footfalls, snapping branches, and deep huffing breaths that seemed to shake the very air around him. He turned toward the sound instinctively, his fishing rod still bent under the weight of the fish, and found himself face to face with a creature from his deepest nightmares. Bear 211 stood at the water's edge in full threat display, his massive head lowered and his lips pulled back to reveal canine teeth that were longer than a man's fingers. His ears were flattened against his skull, and his small eyes burned with an intensity that spoke of pure predatory focus. The bear's shoulder hump, a mass of muscle that powered his devastating forepaws, rippled with tension as he prepared to attack. Saliva dripped from his open mouth, and his breathing created visible puffs of vapor in the cool morning air. For a moment that lasted an eternity, predator and prey stared at each other across the narrow strip of water that separated them. Michael felt his bladder release involuntarily, the warm urine mixing with the cold river water around his legs. His hands began to shake uncontrollably, and the fishing rod slipped from his nerveless fingers, the line going slack as the giant trout realized it was free and disappeared into the depths. Michael's mind, trained by decades of wilderness experience and his father's careful instruction, began to function despite his terror. He remembered the rules that had been drilled into him since childhood. Do not run. Do not make sudden movements. Make yourself appear larger. Back away slowly. Speak in calm, low tones. Reach for the bear spray. Easy, Bear, Michael said, his voice cracking with fear but remaining surprisingly steady. Easy now. I'm not a threat to you. His right hand began moving slowly toward the canister of bear spray clipped to his belt, while his left arm raised slowly above his head to make himself appear larger. I'm going to back away now. Nice and slow, Bear 211 watched these movements with the calculating intelligence of a veteran predator. He had encountered humans before, many times, and had learned to read their behavior patterns. The raised arm, the slow backing movement, and the calm voice were all familiar to him. Most humans, when confronted by his presence, would eventually retreat, leaving him in control of the territory. But something about this particular human's scent signature was triggering a different response, something deeper and more aggressive than simple territorial dominance. The problem was blood. During his battle with the large trout, Michael had caught his hand on a sharp edge of his fly box, opening a small cut on his palm that had bled freely before clotting. The scent of human blood mixed with the fish slime on his hands and the adrenaline now pouring through his system created a combination of odors that awakened the bear's predatory instincts in a way that simple human presence never could. Michael managed to get his fingers around the bear spray canister and was beginning to draw it from his belt when Bear 211 made his decision. The bear dropped to all fours and plunged into the river with a splash that sent water cascading in all directions. The current, which had been Michael's ally in fighting the fish, now became his enemy as it slowed the bear's progress, but also created a barrier that made accurate use of the bear spray nearly impossible. "Oh God, oh God, oh God," Michael whispered, as he watched 700 pounds of apex predator churning through the water toward him with single-minded purpose. The bear's powerful stroke created waves that reached nearly to Michael's chest, and the distance between them was closing with horrifying speed. Michael's hand finally closed around the bear spray canister, but in his panic, he fumbled with the safety mechanism that prevented accidental discharge. Bear 211 reached Michael's position in the river in less than 15 seconds. The water, which had been waist-deep on the human, barely reached the bear's chest, and his powerful legs found secure purchase on the rocky bottom while Michael struggled to maintain his footing in his bulky waders. The bear's first swipe was exploratory, a casual blow with his left forepaw that caught Michael across the right shoulder and sent him spinning sideways into the current. The force of the blow was beyond anything Michael could have imagined. The bear's paw, armed with claws that were longer than a man's fingers and sharp enough to shred bark from trees, tore through his waders, his jacket, and the flesh beneath as if they were made of tissue paper. 4 parallel gashes opened across his shoulder and chest, immediately releasing a flood of bright red blood that mixed with the river water and created a crimson cloud that drifted downstream with the current. Michael's scream echoed off the canyon walls, a sound of pure animal terror that sent every bird within a mile radius exploding from their perches. The pain was indescribable, a white-hot explosion that seemed to emanate from every nerve ending simultaneously. But worse than the pain was the realization that this was only the beginning, that the creature now standing over him in the river was just getting started. Bear 211's second attack was more deliberate. The bear grabbed Michael by the left leg with his massive jaws, the inch-long canine teeth penetrating completely through the neoprene waders and deep into the muscle beneath. Michael felt the bones in his shin crack under the tremendous pressure, and a new wave of agony joined the symphony of pain already overwhelming his nervous system. The bear began to shake his head from side to side, the way a dog might worry a toy, and Michael's body whipped back and forth like a rag doll. His head went underwater repeatedly, and he swallowed mouthfuls of river water mixed with his own blood. The world became a nightmare kaleidoscope of pain, terror, and the crushing reality that he was about to die in the most horrible way imaginable. Through the haze of shock and agony, Michael managed to deploy his bear spray. The canister had somehow remained in his grip despite everything, and in a moment of desperate clarity, he managed to aim it toward the bear's face and depress the trigger. The high-pressure stream of capsaicin concentrate hit Bear 211 directly in the eyes and nose, and the bear's reaction was immediate and violent. Bear 211 released his grip on Michael's leg and reared back on his hind legs, his massive head thrashing from side to side as he pawed at his burning eyes. The bear spray, designed specifically for use against aggressive bears, contained a concentration of capsaicin that was several times stronger than pepper spray intended for human attackers. The chemical agent caused immediate and intense pain in the bear's sensitive mucous membranes, temporarily blinding him and making breathing difficult. Michael saw his opportunity and tried to run, but his shattered leg could not support his weight. He fell face first into the river, the current immediately catching him and carrying him downstream toward a series of rapids that he knew from experience were dangerous even for experienced swimmers. His waders, torn and flooding with water, became dead weight that dragged him deeper beneath the surface. The bear spray's effect on Bear 211 was temporary, lasting no more than 90 seconds before the big predator's vision began to clear and his breathing returned to normal. Grizzly bears have an incredible tolerance for pain and discomfort, evolved over millennia to deal with everything from porcupine quills to the claws of rival bears. The capsaicin spray, while effective as a deterrent, was not enough to stop a bear that had already committed to an attack. Bear 211 located Michael's position in the water by scent and sound, his acute hearing tracking the splashing and gasping sounds the injured human was making as he struggled against the current. The bear plunged back into the river, his powerful swimming stroke quickly closing the distance despite the handicap of temporary eye irritation. Michael, meanwhile, was fighting for his life against both the river and his catastrophic injuries. The current was carrying him toward a series of large boulders that created a dangerous rapid, and he knew that if he was swept into the white water in his current condition, he would drown within minutes. His left leg was completely useless, the bone clearly broken and the muscle tissue severely damaged by the bear's jaws. His right shoulder and chest burned with a pain that made it difficult to move his arm effectively. But Michael Reynolds was not a man who gave up easily. The same determination that had built his successful accounting practice and sustained him through 23 years of marriage now focused on the singular goal of survival. Using his good leg and his less injured arm, he managed to grab hold of a partially submerged log that was wedged against a boulder near the center of the river. The log was slippery with algae and barely large enough to support his weight, but it represented his only chance of avoiding the rapids downstream. Michael pulled himself partially out of the water, gasping and shivering as the morning air hit his wet clothing and exposed wounds. Blood was still flowing freely from the gashes across his shoulder and chest, and he could feel his strength ebbing with each heartbeat. Bear 211 reached the log 30 seconds later, his massive bulk creating waves that washed over Michael's precarious refuge. The bear's eyesight had largely recovered from the pepper spray, and his small, intelligent eyes fixed on his prey with renewed focus. This human had injured him, had caused him pain and temporary blindness, and that transgression demanded a response. The bear's third attack was the most devastating. Standing chest-deep in the current beside the log, Bear 211 reared up on his hind legs and brought both forepaws down on Michael's back with crushing force. The blow drove Michael face first into the log, with enough impact to crack 2 ribs and drive all the air from his lungs. The bear's claws raked across his back, opening 5 parallel gashes that ran from his shoulder blades to his lower back. Michael's scream was cut short, as his face was driven underwater and he inhaled a lungful of river water mixed with his own blood. Panic-driven reflexes caused him to struggle violently, but the bear's weight was holding him down, and his damaged body lacked the strength to break free. The world began to dim around the edges as oxygen starvation took hold, and Michael realized with crystal clarity that he was about to drown. But Bear 211 was not finished with his prey. The bear grabbed Michael by the back of his jacket and hauled him out of the water with casual ease, the way a fisherman might lift a trout from a stream. Michael gasped and coughed, expelling river water and blood from his lungs as the bear held him suspended above the surface. For a moment hope flickered in his consciousness. Perhaps the bear would be satisfied with having established dominance. Perhaps this nightmare would end with his survival. The hope died as Bear 211's jaws closed around Michael's head. The bear's massive skull was perfectly designed for delivering crushing bite forces that could crack the bones of bison and elk. His jaw muscles, powered by the enormous temporalis muscles that created his distinctive facial profile, could generate over 1,500 pounds per square inch of pressure. When those jaws closed around Michael's head, The human skull began to compress like an eggshell. Michael's final scream was cut short as Bear 211's teeth penetrated his scalp and began to crack through the bone beneath. The pain was beyond description, beyond any reference point in human experience. For 3 seconds that lasted an eternity, Michael remained conscious as his skull began to fracture, his brain experiencing pressure and trauma that his nervous system was never designed to process. At 9:26 a.m. on June 14, 2024, Michael Anthony Reynolds died in the jaws of Bear 211, his body going limp as catastrophic brain trauma shut down his central nervous system. The entire attack had lasted less than 3 minutes from first contact to death, but those 3 minutes contained more violence and terror than most people experience in a lifetime. Bear 211 held his victim's body for another 30 seconds, ensuring that the threat was neutralized before releasing his grip and allowing Michael's corpse to slip into the river. The current immediately caught the body and began carrying it downstream toward the rapids, where it would likely become wedged among the boulders and remain undiscovered for hours or perhaps days. The bear stood in the shallow water for several minutes, his head raised to test the air for other threats or opportunities. The scent of blood was thick around him, both from his victim and from his own minor wounds suffered during the encounter with the bear spray. His fur was matted with blood and river water, giving him an even more fearsome appearance than usual. Satisfied that he had successfully defended his territory, Bear 211 waded back to shore and disappeared into the forest, as quietly as he had emerged. Within minutes, the only evidence of the attack was a crimson stain in the water that grew fainter with each passing moment as it was diluted by the river's flow. The first witness to the aftermath was Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a wildlife biologist from Colorado State University, who was conducting research on cutthroat trout spawning behavior in the Yellowstone River system. Dr. Martinez, 34 years old, had been working in the area for the past 2 weeks, collecting data on fish populations and water quality as part of a comprehensive ecosystem study funded by the National Science Foundation. Dr. Martinez had been setting up her equipment at a monitoring station approximately half a mile downstream from the attack site when she noticed something unusual floating in the river. At first, she assumed it was a log or other debris that had been washed into the current by the previous week's mild flooding, but as the object drifted closer to her position, she began to make out details that sent a chill of recognition through her experienced field researcher's mind. "Oh my God," she whispered as she realized she was looking at a human body floating face down in the water, arms outstretched and clothing torn and bloody. Dr. Martinez immediately dropped her equipment and waded into the river, fighting against the current to reach what she now clearly recognized as a deceased person. The body was that of a middle-aged man wearing fishing gear, his waders punctured and torn in multiple places, and his jacket shredded across the back and shoulders. Deep lacerations were visible across his scalp and neck, and the water around him was tinged pink with diluted blood. Dr. Martinez, who had conducted wildlife research in bear country for over a decade, immediately recognized the distinctive pattern of injuries as consistent with a grizzly bear attack. With considerable effort, Dr. Martinez managed to pull the body to shore and drag it up onto a gravel bar where she could examine it more thoroughly. The man's injuries were catastrophic, clearly fatal, and obviously the result of a violent encounter with a large predator. Claw marks across his back and shoulders matched the spacing and depth that would be expected from a mature grizzly bear, and the trauma to his head and neck was consistent with a crushing bite from powerful jaws. Dr. Martinez immediately activated the emergency beacon on her satellite communicator, a device that all researchers working in remote areas of Yellowstone were required to carry. The beacon sent a distress signal that was received by Park Dispatch within minutes. automatically providing GPS coordinates for her location and indicating the nature of the emergency through a series of coded transmissions. While waiting for emergency responders to arrive, Dr. Martinez used her field camera to document the scene, taking photographs of the body and the surrounding area that would later prove crucial to the investigation. She also began searching the area for additional evidence, including the victim's fishing equipment and any signs of the attack location. The first emergency responders to reach the scene were park rangers Thomas Williams and Rebecca Chen, both experienced law enforcement officers who specialized in wilderness rescue and wildlife encounters. Ranger Williams, a 28-year veteran of the National Park Service, had investigated dozens of bear attacks during his career and immediately recognized the severity of the situation. "This is Ranger Williams at the Gardner River incident site," he radioed to dispatch at 10:47 a.m. "We have confirmation of a fatal grizzly bear attack. The victim appears to be an adult male, probably mid-40s, extensive trauma consistent with a large bear. We're going to need the full response team out here, including wildlife management and the coroner." Ranger Chen, meanwhile, began the process of securing the scene and collecting evidence. The location where Dr. Martinez had found the body was clearly not the attack site, as there were no signs of struggle or blood on the gravel bar. The victim had obviously been carried downstream by the current, which meant the actual location of the encounter could be anywhere within several miles upstream. The search for the attack site began immediately, with teams of rangers working their way up the river while looking for signs of disturbance, blood, or bear activity. The process was complicated by the fact that the river had continued flowing for over an hour since the attack, washing away much of the physical evidence that would normally be present at such a scene. At 11:23 a.m., Ranger Williams discovered Michael's fishing rod snagged on a fallen tree approximately 3/4 of a mile upstream from where the body had been found. The rod was still rigged with a pale morning dunfly. An examination of the line showed that it had been broken rather than cut, suggesting it had parted under extreme stress. The location was in deep water, with good cover along both banks, exactly the kind of area where both large trout and grizzly bears would be likely to concentrate. Further investigation of the area revealed additional evidence of the attack. Bear tracks in the mud along the riverbank were clearly visible, including several that showed the distinctive long claws and large size that indicated a mature male grizzly. Blood spatter on nearby rocks and vegetation confirmed that this was indeed the location where Michael Reynolds had met his death. Wildlife biologist Dr. Sarah Thompson arrived on scene at 12:15 p.m. to assist with the investigation. Dr. Thompson, a specialist in grizzly bear behavior with over 15 years of experience in Yellowstone, began the process of analyzing the attack site to determine what factors had contributed to the fatal encounter. "Based on the evidence I'm seeing here," Dr. Thompson told the assembled team of investigators, "this appears to have been a predatory attack rather than a defensive encounter. The victim was fishing alone, probably making noise and movement that attracted the bear's attention. The blood evidence suggests the attack lasted several minutes and involved multiple contacts between the bear and victim. Dr. Thompson's analysis was based on her extensive knowledge of grizzly bear behavior patterns and attack characteristics. Defensive attacks, which occurred when bears were surprised or protecting cubs, typically involved a brief, violent encounter followed by the bear's immediate departure from the area. Predatory attacks, while less common, were more sustained and usually resulted in more severe injuries to the victim. "The concerning thing about this incident, Dr. Thompson continued, is that it suggests we may have a bear in the area that has lost its natural fear of humans and is actively hunting them as prey. That's an extremely dangerous situation that requires immediate action. The identification of the victim began with an examination of his personal effects. Michael's wallet, containing his driver's license and credit cards, had remained secure in a waterproof pocket of his fishing vest, despite the violence of the attack. Park rangers were able to quickly determine that the victim was Michael Anthony Reynolds of Bozeman, Montana, age 42, married with no children according to the emergency contact information in his wallet. The notification of next of kin fell to Chief Ranger David Patterson, a 30-year veteran of the Park Service who had delivered similar news to dozens of families over the course of his career. At 2:30 p.m., Ranger Patterson knocked on the door of the Reynolds home on Maple Street in Bozeman, his uniform hat in his hands, and his face bearing the grim expression that immediately told Sarah Reynolds that her worst fears had been realized. "Mrs. Reynolds, I'm Chief Ranger Patterson with Yellowstone National Park. I'm afraid I have some very difficult news about your husband, Michael." Sarah Reynolds collapsed into a chair in her living room, her hands shaking as she processed the words that no spouse ever wants to hear. Michael had been the center of her world for over 2 decades. Her partner in everything from running their household to planning their retirement dreams. The thought that he might not walk back through their front door had always been a possibility she acknowledged, but never seriously considered. "How did it happen?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the ticking of the grandfather clock that Michael had inherited from his father. Ranger Patterson explained the circumstances of the attack as gently as possible, emphasizing that Michael's death had been quick and that he had been doing something he loved in a place that had brought him joy for decades. But no words could soften the reality of what had occurred or prepare Sarah for the long journey of grief and adjustment that stretched ahead of her. The news of Michael Reynolds' death reached the media within hours of the family notification. Park officials held a press conference at 6 p.m. that evening, with Park Superintendent Elizabeth Morrison providing details of the attack while emphasizing that such incidents were extremely rare in Yellowstone's history. "This is a tragic reminder that Yellowstone is home to wild animals that can be dangerous," Superintendent Morrison told the assembled reporters. "We extend our deepest condolences to the Reynolds family, and we want to assure the public that we are taking all appropriate measures to locate the bear responsible for this attack." The media response was immediate and intense. Local television stations led their evening broadcasts with the story, and by the following morning, national news outlets had picked up the coverage. The attack became a symbol of the ongoing debate about wildlife management in national parks, with some calling for more aggressive measures to control bear populations, while others argued for increased public education about bear safety. Wildlife officials began the process of locating and capturing Bear 211 within hours of identifying him as the likely perpetrator of the attack. The bear's radio collar, which had been functioning normally throughout the incident, provided researchers with detailed location data that showed his movements in the days before and after the attack. The tracking data confirms that the collared male we've designated as Bear 211 was in the immediate area at the time of the attack. Dr. Thompson explained to her colleagues during an emergency meeting held that evening. His movement patterns and behavior history also suggest that he may be the individual responsible. The decision to euthanize Bear 211 was not made lightly. Park policy dictated that any bear involved in a fatal attack on humans must be destroyed, both to prevent future incidents and to maintain public confidence in park safety measures. But the process of locating and safely capturing a 700-pound grizzly bear in the wilderness required careful planning and specialized equipment. A team of wildlife specialists, including expert trackers and veterinarians trained in large animal immobilization, was assembled to carry out the operation. Using helicopters and tranquilizer darts, they located Bear 211 at dawn on June 16th, approximately 10 miles from the attack site. The bear was feeding on an elk carcass, behavior that was consistent with his known patterns, but also demonstrated his continued presence in an area frequented by park visitors. The immobilization and subsequent euthanization of Bear 211 was carried out according to established protocols, with tissue samples collected for analysis and the bear's body transported to the park's research facility for necropsy. The examination confirmed that this was indeed the animal responsible for Michael Reynolds' death, with human hair and tissue found beneath his claws and human blood detected on his teeth and fur. The necropsy also revealed additional information about Bear 211's history and condition. Examination of his teeth showed that he was older than originally estimated, probably 25 or 26 years old, rather than the 23 years indicated by his capture records. His body weight had increased to over 700 pounds, making him one of the largest grizzly bears ever documented in the Yellowstone ecosystem. Most significantly, the examination revealed evidence of previous injuries that may have contributed to his aggressive behavior. Old scars across his face and shoulders indicated multiple fights with other bears, and X-rays showed healed fractures in his skull that were consistent with being struck by a vehicle at some point in his past. Such injuries, while not uncommon in wild bears, can sometimes result in neurological damage that affects behavior and increases aggression toward humans. The funeral service for Michael Anthony Reynolds was held on June 20th at the First Presbyterian Church in Bozeman, with over 300 people in attendance. The congregation included family members, friends, clients from his accounting practice, and fellow anglers who had shared his passion for fly fishing in Montana's wilderness areas. Sarah Reynolds delivered a eulogy that captured both her husband's love for the outdoors and her own struggle to understand how that love had ultimately cost him his life. "Michael always said that the river was where he felt closest to God," she told the mourners. "I have to believe that in his final moments, he was in the place he loved most, doing the thing that brought him the greatest joy." The service was followed by a private burial in the Bozeman Cemetery, where Michael was laid to rest beneath a simple granite headstone that bore his name, dates, and the inscription "Gone Fishing." The headstone faced west, toward the mountains and rivers where he had spent so many happy hours during his life. In the weeks that followed Michael's death, Sarah Reynolds found herself struggling with emotions that ranged from grief and anger to profound loneliness and fear. The house on Maple Street, which had been filled with Michael's presence and energy for over 20 years, now felt empty and alien. His fishing equipment, still arranged in the garage exactly as he had left it, became a painful reminder of dreams and adventures that would never be fulfilled. Sarah began meeting with Dr. Patricia Williams, a grief counselor who specialized in helping families cope with sudden traumatic deaths. The sessions were difficult, forcing her to confront not only her loss, but also her anger toward the wilderness that had taken her husband and the system that had failed to protect him. "I keep thinking that there must have been something that could have been done differently," Sarah confided during one of their sessions. "If the Park Service had better warning systems, if Michael had carried a different kind of bear spray, if he had fished somewhere else that day. There are so many what-ifs that I can't stop thinking about them." Dr. Williams helped Sarah understand that such thoughts were a normal part of the grieving process, a way for the mind to try to make sense of senseless tragedy. But she also emphasized that Michael's death was not the result of anyone's negligence or poor decision-making. It was simply a rare and tragic encounter between a human being and a wild animal that was following its own instincts for survival and territory protection. The legal aftermath of Michael's death proved to be relatively straightforward, as park officials had followed established protocols in their response to the incident and their subsequent investigation. The The Reynolds family chose not to file any lawsuits against the National Park Service, recognizing that Michael had voluntarily accepted the risks inherent in fishing alone in bear country. However, the incident did result in several policy changes within Yellowstone National Park. New warning signs were installed at popular fishing access points, providing more detailed information about bear safety and the importance of carrying bear spray. Park rangers also increased their patrols in areas with high bear activity, and new requirements were implemented for backcountry permits in certain areas during peak bear season. The tragedy also sparked renewed interest in bear safety education among Montana's outdoor recreation community. The Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks Department developed new educational materials specifically focused on bear encounters during fishing activities, and sporting goods stores began offering bear safety courses as a complement to their fishing equipment sales. 6 months after Michael's death, Sarah Reynolds made the difficult decision to sell their home in Bozeman and relocate to Seattle, where her sister lived. The memories associated with Montana, while precious, had become too painful for her to face on a daily basis. Before leaving, she donated Michael's extensive fly fishing collection to the Montana State University Library, where it would be available for research and education about the state's angling heritage. The final entry in Michael's fishing journal, written the evening before his fatal trip, read, "Conditions look perfect for tomorrow. Water temperature optimal, weather clear, insect activity should be excellent. This could be the best day of the season." The tragic irony of those words was not lost on anyone who read them, a reminder that in nature, perfection and peril often exist in the same moment, separated only by chance and circumstance. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, the wildlife biologist who had discovered Michael's body, continued her research in the Yellowstone ecosystem, but found herself forever changed by the experience. She began incorporating bear safety education into her public presentations about wildlife research, using Michael's story as a powerful reminder that even experienced outdoorsmen could fall victim to the unpredictable nature of wild animals. "People need to understand that bears are not malicious," Dr. Martinez would tell audiences during her presentations. "They're not evil or vindictive. They're wild animals following their instincts, and sometimes those instincts conflict with human presence in ways that have tragic consequences. The best we can do is educate ourselves, take appropriate precautions, and accept that there will always be risks associated with spending time in their habitat." The Yellowstone River continued to flow past the site where Michael Reynolds had died, its current carrying no memory of the violence that had occurred in its waters. The pool where he had hooked his final fish remained a productive fishing spot, visited by anglers who had no knowledge of the tragedy that had taken place there. New generations of cutthroat trout took up residence in the deeper water, and life in the river ecosystem continued its endless cycle of birth, death, and renewal. Bear 211's territory was eventually claimed by a younger male, a 12-year-old grizzly that had been dispersing from his mother's range and searching for a place to establish himself as a breeding adult. This new bear, designated as Bear 347 by researchers, exhibited normal behavior patterns and showed no signs of the aggression or human habituation that had made his predecessor so dangerous. The tragic death of Michael Anthony Reynolds became part of Yellowstone's history, recorded in park records alongside the dozens of other fatal wildlife encounters that had occurred since the park's establishment in 1872. His story served as a reminder that America's national parks preserve not just scenic beauty, but also genuine wilderness, complete with all the risks and rewards that such wildness entails. For those who knew Michael personally, his death remained a source of profound sadness, but also of inspiration. His passion for the outdoors and his respect for the natural world became his legacy, influencing friends and family members to develop their own appreciation for wilderness and conservation. Several of his former clients established a scholarship fund in his name, providing financial assistance for Montana students pursuing degrees in outdoor recreation or environmental science. Sarah Reynolds eventually remarried, finding love again with a man who understood her loss and respected the memory of her first husband. She never returned to Montana, but she kept a photograph of Michael on the Yellowstone River on her desk, a reminder of the man who had shared her life for over 2 decades and the wilderness that had ultimately claimed him. The story of June 14, 2024, became a cautionary tale told around campfires and in outdoor education classes across the American West. It served as a powerful reminder that nature, while beautiful and inspiring, remains fundamentally wild and unpredictable. Michael Reynolds' death was not the result of anyone's carelessness or poor judgment, but rather a stark illustration of the fine line that separates survival from tragedy when humans enter the domain of apex predators. In the end, Michael Reynolds died doing what he loved, in a place that had brought him joy throughout his adult life. While his death was tragic and violent, those who knew him best found comfort in the knowledge that he had lived fully and passionately, pursuing his dreams in the wild places that called to his soul. The Yellowstone River, indifferent to human tragedy but eternal in its beauty, continued to flow toward the sea, carrying with it the memory of a man who had loved it enough to risk everything for just one more day in its embrace. The investigation into Michael's death officially concluded 3 months after the incident, with a final report that attributed the attack to a combination of factors including the bear's age and previous injuries, the victim's solitary presence in prime habitat during peak activity season, and the unfortunate coincidence of optimal feeding conditions that had concentrated both bears and their prey in the same area. The report made several recommendations for improved safety protocols and public education, but acknowledged that such encounters, while rare, were an inherent risk of wilderness recreation in grizzly bear habitat. Park officials used the incident as an opportunity to review and update their wildlife management policies, implementing new procedures for monitoring problem bears and improving communication between researchers and law enforcement personnel. The tragedy also led to increased funding for bear research and habitat improvement projects, turning Michael's death into a catalyst for better understanding and protection of the grizzly bears that had taken his life. Years later, when visitors to Yellowstone asked park rangers about bear safety, they would often hear Michael Reynolds' story as part of their education. Not as a tale of horror designed to frighten people away from the wilderness, but as a respectful tribute to a man who understood and accepted the risks of his passion, and whose death served as a reminder that true wilderness is both beautiful and dangerous, a place where life and death dance together in an eternal ballet that has been playing out for millions of years. The morning mist that had cloaked the Yellowstone River on June 14, 2024, had lifted by the time emergency responders arrived to investigate Michael's death. But in a sense, that mist never truly cleared for those who were touched by the tragedy. It lingered in the memories of his friends and family, in the cautionary tales told by park rangers, and in the knowledge that somewhere in the wilderness other apex predators continued their ancient hunt, indifferent to human presence and human plans. Michael Anthony Reynolds, 42 years old, devoted husband, successful businessman, and passionate angler, became one with the wild country he had loved on that June morning, his life ending in the jaws of Bear 211, but his spirit joining the eternal flow of the Yellowstone River, where cutthroat trout still rise to mayfly hatches and grizzly bears still rule their ancient domain. In death, he became part of the wilderness that had called to him throughout his life, A reminder that some places on Earth remain truly wild, truly dangerous, and truly alive with the primal forces that shaped our world long before humans walked upon it and will continue long after we are gone. The river flows on, carrying its secrets and its stories toward a distant sea, and somewhere in its depths, the ghost of Michael Reynolds continues his eternal fishing, casting his line into waters where time has no meaning and the hunt never ends.